Avatar: The Last Airbender Season 2 opens with a desperate group of refugees who barely escaped Amashu before it fell into the hands of Fire Lord Ozai's daughter, Azula. Now they are running for their lives, with Fire Nation troops closing in fast. Just when it looks like they might be overwhelmed, Team Avatar arrives to defend them, and right away, it's clear this group is no longer the same inexperienced team we saw before. Sokka can actually stand his ground in combat now. Katara has grown into a seriously powerful waterbender, moving with confidence and control. Even Aang has picked up a lot from training with her, though he still has a long way to go before reaching her level. The fight turns in their favor even more when Suki shows up with her fearless Kyoshi warriors, giving the group the backup they need. With everyone distracted, Aang uses the moment to slip into the prison and search for his old friend, King Bumi. His hope is simple: rescue Bumi and convince him to become his earthbending teacher. But Bumi has no interest in escaping. In fact, he explains that he allowed Azula to capture him on purpose. He didn't want the people of Amashu to sacrifice their lives trying to protect their king, so he chose surrender over bloodshed. Aang begs him to leave, but Bumi refuses. He has made peace with his decision, and no amount of pleading changes his mind. Before Aang goes, though, Bumi gives him one important clue. He tells him that the teacher he needs is someone who listens and waits, and he urges Aang to think carefully about what that really means. With Bumi's strange advice stuck in his head, Aang reunites with the others, and Team Avatar continues traveling with the refugees. Their path eventually brings them to the Serpent Pass, a dangerous river crossing with a terrifying reputation. To help everyone get through safely, Aang and Katara use their waterbending to part the river, creating a clear path straight through the middle. For a moment, it seems like the plan is working. But before the refugees can reach the opposite side, Fire Nation soldiers suddenly appear and start blasting fire into the water. At first, the group assumes they are the targets, but then they realize the soldiers are actually attacking something beneath the surface, a massive serpent living in the river. Team Avatar initially believes the creature might be on their side, fighting back against the Fire Nation. But that hope does not last long. The serpent quickly turns its fury toward the shore and begins attacking the refugees instead. Aang and Katara jump into action, using their waterbending to push the creature away, but in the chaos they end up hurting it badly. Once the danger passes, guilt hits them hard. The serpent was not evil. It was just a wounded creature caught in the middle of the violence. So Aang and Katara use waterbending healing techniques to treat its injuries. Through this moment, Aang gets his first real lesson in the basics of spiritual healing, understanding that bending is not only about fighting, but also about restoring balance. After surviving the Serpent Pass, the group's journey continues toward Ba Sing Se. At first, it almost seems like Amashu should have been the biggest stronghold in the Earth Kingdom, but Ba Sing Se is on an entirely different level. This is the city everyone wants to reach, the place seen as the greatest hope for safety. Naturally, that makes it the exact place Azula wants her father to attack next. Back in the Fire Nation, Azula presents a bold invasion plan during a royal council meeting. She lays out her strategy with complete confidence, and Fire Lord Ozai clearly recognizes how clever it is. But instead of rewarding her with command of the army, he gives that role to General Ving Tran. Azula is handed a different mission altogether. Ozai orders her to hunt down Prince Zuko and Uncle Iroh, who have fallen into a miserable life since being banished. The two are now living in poverty, working in fields for barely any money. Iroh seems to accept this quieter life with surprising calm, but Zuko is miserable every second of it. He cannot stand how far they have fallen. Eventually, all of Zuko's anger boils over. He turns on Iroh and unleashes years of resentment. In Zuko's mind, Iroh should have taken the throne long ago. If Iroh had fought for what was his instead of drowning in grief after losing his son in battle, Ozai would never have taken power. Zuko blames his uncle's weakness for everything that happened to them. After throwing those painful words at him, Zuko walks away, determined to find the Avatar by himself. Azula, however, understands her brother better than he realizes. She already expects him to go after Aang, so instead of wasting time searching everywhere for Zuko, she follows the Avatar's trail, knowing that sooner or later, Zuko will appear in the same place. That trail eventually brings everyone to the wealthy town of Jailing. Aang expects that, according to old air nomad customs, people will offer them food freely. But the world has changed, and he quickly learns that tradition does not exactly pay for dinner anymore. With the refugees still needing help, the group discovers an underground earthbending tournament, and Aang sees a chance to win prize money so they can buy food. Inside the tournament arena, the reigning champion is a powerful fighter known as the Boulder. Ong prepares to challenge him, hoping the prize will solve their problem. But before he can step forward, another fighter enters the ring, a blind girl known only as the Blind Bandit. Nobody expects much from her at first, but that changes instantly. She completely destroys her opponent, using the vibrations in the ground to sense every movement around her. She does not need sight because the earth itself tells her where everything is. Watching her fight, Ong suddenly remembers Bumi's words, a teacher who listens and waits. In that moment, he realizes this blind earthbender might be exactly who Bumi was talking about. She is not just strong, she understands earthbending in a way Ong has never seen before. Unfortunately, before Ong can speak to her properly, the Blind Bandit disappears after the tournament, leaving him with more questions than answers. Soon afterward, Team Avatar receives an invitation from the Bei Fong family, one of the richest and most powerful families in Jailing. They have supported several avatars in the past, so Ong and his friends accept the invitation and visit their estate. Once they arrive, they discover the shocking truth. The Blind Bandit is actually Toph Bei Fong, the family's daughter. Her parents see her as fragile, helpless, and in constant need of protection. They have no idea that their delicate daughter has secretly become one of the most impressive earthbenders in the region. Toph has built an entirely separate identity underground, where she is feared and respected as a champion fighter. During dinner, Ong almost exposes her secret without meaning to. Before he can say too much, Toph attacks him under the table, forcing him to stay quiet. While everyone else remains unaware, she uses earthbending to carve a message into the ground, telling Ong to meet her later that night, and more importantly, to stop talking about her fighting. Later, when Ong finally meets her in secret, Toph opens up and tells him the truth about her life. When Toph was only about 6 or 7 years old, she accidentally found her way into a cave filled with badger moles, the very first earthbenders. And because they were blind just like her, there was an instant, silent understanding between them. They experienced the world the same way, not through sight, but through movement, pressure, and vibration. By watching how they moved and copying their rhythm, Toph slowly taught herself earthbending in its purest form. The wild part is that her parents have absolutely no clue what she can really do. They believe she is helpless and fragile, so they hired an instructor with very strict orders, only teach her the simplest basics and never push her beyond that. In their minds, Toph needs protection from the world. In reality, she could probably handle most of the world by herself. Toph does want to help Ong. She knows she could teach him in a way no one else can, but she also tells him she cannot just leave, because her parents control every part of her life. Meanwhile, fate brings Zuko to Jailing as well. While passing through the area, he sees a local boy getting bullied at a checkpoint, where soldiers are demanding half of his produce just to let him through. Zuko steps in and confronts them, helping the boy out of trouble. Grateful for what he did, the boy and his sister offer him shelter, and Zuko stays with them for a while. But the moment he hears that the Avatar is nearby, everything changes. Zuko immediately heads out to find Ong, only to be intercepted by Azula first. She tells him that their father has changed his mind, that Zuko's banishment has been lifted, and that she has been sent to bring him back home. Zuko does not trust her for even a second. The tension quickly turns into a fight, and right in the middle of it, Team Avatar arrives. Toph joins the clash too, showing just enough power to make Azula reconsider her position. Forced to retreat, Azula does not leave quietly. Before escaping, she attacks Iroh, who had arrived to protect Zuko. Team Avatar offers to heal Iroh using waterbending, but Zuko refuses their help completely. His pride will not allow him to accept kindness from the people he has spent so long chasing. Honestly, Zuko's behavior is frustrating because deep down, he has never truly been like Azula. Even when they were children, the difference between them was obvious. Zuko clearly inherited more of his mother's heart. Azula, on the other hand, was already showing a cruel edge at a very young age. As kids, Azula would entertain herself by throwing bread at turtle ducks, while Zuko tried to stop her because he actually felt bad for them. Ozai encouraged that harshness in Azula. He pushed both children to compete, to dominate, and to see each other as rivals instead of siblings. Their mother, Ursa, hated what Ozai was turning them into. She saw the damage being done and even tried to escape with both children, hoping to get them away from his influence. But before she could succeed, she was caught. That upbringing still affects Zuko. Part of him knows the difference between right and wrong, but another part of him is still desperate to prove himself to his father. That conflict keeps pulling him apart. Back in Jailing, Toph finally refuses to live under her parents' version of who she is. She tells them she is not some delicate flower they can keep locked away. She is a rock, solid, stubborn, and impossible to control. Then she makes her choice and runs away with Team Avatar. her parents are furious. Instead of accepting that their daughter has chosen her own path, they hire the boulder to track her down and drag her home by force. With Toph now officially part of the group, Team Avatar continues toward Ba Sing Se. As they get closer to the city, Toph senses something moving beneath the ground, following them from a distance. She quickly realizes they are being tracked. To protect the refugees, Toph comes up with a plan. She and Aang will make themselves the obvious targets and lead the pursuers away, while Sokka and Katara guide everyone else safely toward the city. It does not take long for Aang and Toph to discover who is after them. The people following them are bounty hunters sent by Toph's wealthy parents, hired specifically to bring her back whether she wants to return or not. Toph decides to use the ambush as a teaching opportunity. Since Aang needs to learn earthbending, she tries to turn the whole situation into a practical lesson, but Aang struggles badly. Earthbending does not come naturally to him at all, and the chaos around him only makes it worse. Everyone starts yelling advice at once: Toph, the bounty hunters, even random voices in the middle of the fight. Aang gets completely overwhelmed. In the end, instead of using earthbending, he falls back on what he already knows and knocks the bounty hunters out with waterbending. When they finally arrive near the border of Ba Sing Se, they hear familiar voices coming from inside the wall. Their friends have already been arrested and locked in cages. Luckily, Toph knows exactly how to handle the situation. She reveals her Bei Fong family name, and the guard's attitude changes instantly. Suddenly, everyone is treated with respect, the prisoners are released, and the refugees are allowed into the city. Getting the refugees safely inside Ba Sing Se was supposed to finish the job, but the moment they arrive, that changes. Sai the Mechanist warns them about the return of Sazan's Comet, a powerful cosmic event that will greatly strengthen Fire Nation firebending. When the comet arrives, the Fire Nation's power could become overwhelming. Aang realizes they cannot just wait for that to happen. He wants to meet the Earth King and convince him to prepare the Earth Kingdom army for a preemptive strike before the Fire Nation becomes unstoppable. But reaching the Earth King is much harder than expected. Their assigned guide, Judy, becomes an obstacle almost immediately. On the surface, she is cheerful, polite, and smiling all the time, but underneath that pleasant attitude, she controls every step they take. She keeps them locked into a strict schedule and refuses to let them do anything outside the approved plan. Even when Katara wants to visit sick refugees, Judy blocks her with the same forced, overly pleasant tone. Eventually, the team manages to get invited to an extravagant royal celebration in the upper ring. But once they arrive, it becomes clear that the wealthy citizens of Ba Sing Se are completely disconnected from the war. They live behind their walls as if the outside world no longer exists. The rich and powerful do not seem worried at all. They believe Ba Sing Se is untouchable, protected forever by its massive walls. General Sung, an arrogant Earth Kingdom officer, makes it even clearer when he tells Aang that the suffering beyond the city is not their problem. Aang tries to go around the system and reach the Earth King directly, but the Dai Li, the royal guard, stop him before he can get close. It feels like another dead end. Then Long Feng appears. He is a powerful minister with enormous influence, and at first he seems surprisingly helpful. He welcomes the team warmly, gives them thoughtful gifts, and acts as though he truly wants to support them. He even promises Aang that he will personally deliver his message to the Earth King. It sounds sincere enough to believe. But when Long Feng supposedly passes the warning along, the Earth King simply shakes his head after hearing whatever Long Feng says. Aang never gets the chance to speak for himself, and the meeting he needs never happens. Frustrated, tired, and running out of patience, Aang vents to Long Feng about everything Sai told them regarding Sazan's Comet. What Aang does not realize is that by revealing how much he knows, he has just made himself and his friends a serious threat in Long Feng's eyes. That same night, Sai quietly vanishes. The Dai Li take him without making a sound, and nobody in the city seems to notice a thing. Meanwhile, outside Ba Sing Se, Azula continues hunting Zuko and Iroh, chasing them all the way to a crowded port. The place erupts into chaos as people rush toward an escape ship, and Azula shows absolutely no mercy. Anyone who fails to board quickly enough is cut down without hesitation. In the middle of the panic, Uncle Iroh falls badly, and after that, his condition begins to worsen fast. Once they are aboard the ship, Zuko runs into Jet and the Freedom Fighters. Jet recognizes an opportunity and proposes a dangerous plan: sneak into the captain's private quarters and steal the food being kept there. Zuko wants nothing to do with it at first, but when Jet mentions that the same room also contains medicine that might help Iroh survive, Zuko's resistance fades. The break-in reveals exactly how complicated Jet's sense of justice still is. He talks like he fights for the helpless, but when things get risky, he puts his own people first. After they get into the treasury, Jet grabs as much food as he can for his crew and then bolts, leaving the others trapped behind. Zuko, surprisingly, becomes the one who does the right thing. Instead of abandoning everyone, he helps the stranded freedom fighters escape with what supplies are left. Then he makes sure the stolen food is handed out to the starving refugees on the ship's deck. It is the kind of selfless action Zuko keeps pretending he is not capable of. Jet feels the weight of his own selfishness after seeing it, while the refugees begin looking at Zuko with real respect. The frustrating thing is, Zuko already has those better instincts inside him. He just keeps fighting against them instead of trusting them. Back in Ba Sing Se, several days pass before anyone truly realizes Sai is missing. Sokka has been sliding notes under Sai's door, getting no replies, and assuming the man is just busy. Aang, meanwhile, has been spending more time with Long Feng, who continues acting like a helpful ally. His bending is improving, too, but there is still one major obstacle holding him back. Aang struggles with what he cannot directly sense. He depends too much on what he can see, and because of that, he cannot fully connect with the deeper side of his abilities. Katara has been taking a different approach to life in the city. At night, while Judy is asleep, she disguises herself as a Kyoshi warrior, complete with face paint, and sneaks into the lower ring to help people who have been ignored by the wealthy and powerful. The truth finally starts coming out because of Professor Zai, the scholar Sokka met at the royal party. When Sokka casually mentions that Sai has not answered him for a week, Professor Zai becomes alarmed. He tells Sokka that disappearances are not unusual in Ba Sing Se. If someone asks too many questions or carries information that threatens the city's perfect image of peace, the Dai Li remove them. Long Feng tries to control the situation by giving Team Avatar an explanation. He claims Sai was taken because he had once worked as a Fire Nation spy. It is not a complete lie, which makes it more dangerous, because it gives Aang just enough truth to keep trusting him. Aang believes him at first, but then he notices someone following him through the streets. Instead of confronting the man directly, Aang decides to turn the situation around. He lets the spy trail him for a while, then uses airbending to circle behind him and start following the follower. Katara is supposed to keep Judy distracted while Aang does this, but her attention shifts when she spots Jet in the city. That distraction pulls her away from the plan, and without Katara covering for him, Aang ends up being captured. But the person behind the surveillance is not who he expects. It is General Sung, and she makes it clear that she is not trying to hurt him. She knows the Fire Nation is gathering outside the city walls. She has been playing along with the official narrative in public because that is what Ba Sing Se demands, but privately she understands the danger is real. Sung needs Aang's help to convince the Earth King before it is too late. She asks him to tell her everything he knows, and Aang explains the truth about Sazan's comet, the Fire Nation threat, and Sai's disappearance. That is when Sung reveals the most disturbing part. Long Feng is not the friendly minister he pretends to be. He is the real power behind the Dai Li, and he controls their entire operation from the shadows. Aang reacts emotionally and refuses to accept it right away. Long Feng has treated him like a friend, so Aang storms toward the palace, determined to demand an audience with the Earth King and clear everything up himself. But before he can reach the king, Long Feng stops him. Then he introduces Aang to a brand new Judy, smiling with the same empty cheerfulness as the last one. That is the moment Aang finally understands. The original Judy was not just reassigned. She was replaced. He has been manipulated from the beginning. Katara's detour brings her straight to Jet, and what she overhears is not good. Jet is planning to attack Fire Nation citizens who have been granted shelter inside Ba Sing Se. The tension began after a Fire Nation man treated homeless people cruelly in the street. Zuko, hidden behind the blue spirit disguise, attacked the man, and during the incident, the man's shop caught fire. After that, the neighborhood blamed the Fire Nation refugees as a whole, even though most of them had nothing to do with it. Jet wants to use the anger to push them out of the city, and he even tries to recruit Zuko into the plan. Zuko refuses. Seeing how dangerous the situation is becoming, Zuko warns the Fire Nation families to leave before Jet comes for them, but they refuse to run. Instead, they stay and wait for the confrontation to happen. When Jet and his group finally arrive, Zuko appears in his blue spirit mask to defend the refugees. At almost the exact same time, Katara shows up with the same goal. The moment she uses waterbending, Jet recognizes her. And once Zuko sees Katara, he immediately realizes the Avatar must be somewhere nearby. Even now, after everything that has happened, Zuko still cannot let go of his obsession. And just as Ba Sing Se's internal problems are getting worse, an even greater danger reaches the city. Azula and her team finally arrive. When Team Avatar first entered Ba Sing Se, the Kyoshi warriors had left because the local government insisted there was no war and claimed their protection was unnecessary. But while traveling away from the city, the warriors discovered the Fire Nation army moving toward Ba Sing Se. Before they could return and warn anyone, Azula and her companions ambushed them. The Kyoshi warriors were defeated, captured, and sent away to a Fire Nation prison. Azula and her companions waste no time making use of the Kyoshi warriors' stolen uniforms. Dressed as the very people Ba Sing Se trusts, they march straight into the city without raising suspicion. To make their disguise even more convincing, they bring General Ving Tran with them as a prisoner, presenting him like proof that they have bravely defeated the Fire Nation's attack. The citizens believe every word of it. They welcome the so-called heroes warmly, never realizing that the most dangerous Fire Nation threat has just walked through their gates wearing the face of their allies. Meanwhile, Team Avatar needs solid evidence about Sazan's comet if they are going to convince the Earth King. Rumors and warnings will not be enough anymore. Professor Zai suggests there may be one place where they can find the exact date of the comet's arrival. A legendary spiritual library once owned by Wan Shi Tong, the Spirit of Knowledge. But the library is not just sitting in the desert waiting to be found. Years ago, Wan Shi Tong pulled it into the spirit realm after humans used the knowledge inside to fuel war and destruction. All that remains in the physical world is a spiritual scar, a faint trace of where the library used to be. Because Jet knows the surrounding area better than anyone, he helps guide the group to the location. Once they find the scar, Ong projects the team into the spirit realm, bringing them face to face with Wan Shi Tong's hidden library. The spirit does not welcome them at first. Wan Shi Tong has no love for humans, and for good reason. The last time people entered his library, Fire Nation soldiers discovered information that could be used against them, and burned part of the collection to keep it from helping their enemies. Professor Zai manages to change his mind by offering a scroll from a previous scholar. The library works through exchange. Knowledge must be traded for knowledge. Wan Shi Tong accepts the offering, but he gives them one firm warning. Nothing they discover inside can be used for battle, warfare, or any kind of attack. Once they are allowed in, the group separates and begins searching through the endless shelves. Ong soon encounters the spirit of Avatar Kuruk, who gives him a warning that hits hard. If an avatar is killed while in the avatar state, the entire cycle of reincarnation ends. There will be no next avatar. No continuation. Everything stops with Ong. It is a reminder that his greatest power is also his greatest risk. Elsewhere in the library, Katara and Jet discover what is left of Jet's old freedom fighter group, and the moment forces Jet's pain to the surface. His bitterness suddenly makes more sense. Most of his friends were killed in the war. They were only children, convinced they were strong enough to handle the fight, until the reality of war crushed that belief. Jet has been carrying the guilt ever since. In his mind, he led them into something they were never ready for. Katara tries to reach him, telling him he cannot keep punishing himself. They were kids trapped inside a war that was far bigger and uglier than any of them understood. The real breakthrough comes from Toph, of all people. She encounters the spirit of Avatar Kyoshi, who reveals something crucial. Sazan's comet may increase firebending to terrifying levels, but there is another celestial event that does the exact opposite, a solar eclipse known as the Day of Black Sun. During that eclipse, firebenders lose their bending completely. That becomes their opening. Sokka, following a spirit fox through the library, finds a celestial chart that could help them calculate exactly when the next eclipse will happen. The team gathers around the chart, trying to narrow down the date that could change the course of the war. But before they can secure the information safely, Professor Zai betrays them. He goes directly to Wan Shi Tong and tells the spirit that the group plans to use the library's knowledge for war. Wan Shi Tong explodes with anger. To him, this is exactly why humans cannot be trusted with knowledge. But Zai does not escape judgment either. Wan Shi Tong despises betrayal just as much as violence, and Zai becomes the first one to suffer the consequences. The massive owl spirit turns on the entire group, chasing them through the library as they desperately race toward the exit. Toph is the first to make it back to the physical world, but the danger does not end there. Wan Shi Tong starts collapsing the library's entrance from the physical side, trying to seal everyone inside the spirit realm forever. Toph plants herself firmly in place and uses every bit of strength she has to hold the structure up with earthbending. She buys the others just enough time to escape, but there is a cost. While she is focused on keeping the library from crushing them all, she cannot defend anything outside. And in that vulnerable moment, Appa is attacked and taken by unknown assailants. Back inside the library, Jet makes one final choice. He sacrifices himself to distract Wan Shitong long enough for the others to reach the exit. Thanks to him, the team gets out alive. But when Ong returns to the physical world, relief is not what comes out of him. He is furious. Appa is gone, and in his pain, Ong turns that anger on Toph, blaming her for not protecting him. Even with Appa missing and the team shaken, the discovery of the eclipse gives them something they cannot ignore, a real chance to stop the Fire Nation. Now they need to get the information directly to Earth King Kui. General Sung helps them sneak into the palace by hiding them inside a wine delivery cart, allowing them to slip past the guards without being stopped. When they finally meet the king, they realize just how carefully Long Feng has shaped him. Kui is not cruel or power-hungry. He is gentle, sheltered, and painfully naive. He spends his time caring for his garden, completely unaware of the war tearing the world apart beyond the city walls. He is not ruling Ba Sing Si in any meaningful way. He is a figurehead, kept innocent on purpose. Team Avatar tells him everything, hoping the truth will finally break through. But before they can fully convince him, Long Feng arrives and starts tearing their credibility apart piece by piece. He mentions Katara's secret activities as a Kyoshi warrior, claiming she has been stirring unrest in the lower ring. He exposes the fact that Toph's family has been supplying machines to the Fire Nation. He identifies Sai as a Fire Nation informant and points out that Sokka was close to him. Every accusation contains just enough truth to make the team look suspicious. Long Feng does not need to lie completely. He only needs to twist reality until the king no longer knows who to trust. Then the king turns to General Sung and asks her directly whether Team Avatar is telling the truth. Sung says they are lying, but she is not doing it because she believes Long Feng. She does it because Long Feng has her daughter, and that leaves her trapped with no real choice. Still, King Kui does not dismiss everything he has heard. One fact clearly bothers him. Long Feng hid the presence of an entire Fire Nation army gathering near the border. That kind of deception cannot be explained away so easily. Quietly furious, the king begins calling for strategic meetings. But the damage has already spread too far. When Team Avatar returns home, Ong finally loses control of everything he has been holding inside. Still grieving Appa's disappearance and overwhelmed by betrayal, pressure, and fear, he lashes out at his friends. Ong had been completely unaware of almost everything Long Feng brought up, and that realization hits the group hard. While they were supposed to be working together, each of them had been running around Ba Sing Si chasing their own problems, keeping secrets, and making separate choices without telling the others. Katara immediately turns her anger towards Sokka. She is furious that he knew about Toph's family supplying machines to the Fire Nation and never said anything, especially when those kinds of machines have been used to hurt Water Tribe people and destroy their homes. Sokka tries to defend himself, explaining that he only learned about it a few days earlier when someone attempted to blackmail Toph, but by then, emotions are already too high for the explanation to matter. One by one, everyone says something they should not have said. The argument cuts deep, and instead of pulling together, the team breaks apart. Each of them storms off in a different direction, and naturally, every single path leads straight into danger. Sokka goes looking for Suki after hearing that the Kyoshi warriors are supposedly in the city. But the moment he arrives, Azula's companions are waiting for him. Before he can react, they paralyze him and take him down. Katara heads back into the lower ring, continuing her secret vigilante work, only to walk directly into a trap set for her. Toph is betrayed in an even more personal way. Her own mother has her tea poisoned, then kidnaps her and begins taking her back home by force. And then there is Zuko. On the day Team Avatar entered the spirit realm, Zuko had found their bodies lying unconscious in the physical world. He stood right over Aang, with the perfect chance to capture the Avatar and finally get what he always claimed he wanted. But he could not do it. Something inside him stopped him. Whether he wants to admit it or not, Zuko is trying to become someone else. Earlier that same day, he saw a woman struggling to calm her crying baby. Later, wearing the blue spirit mask, he secretly left a toy for the child. It is a small act, but for Zuko, it says a lot. When he hears that Katara has been ambushed, he goes after her to help. Unfortunately, that rescue attempt does not go as planned. Zuko and Katara both end up captured and thrown into the same dungeon cell. Back at their hideout, Aang is alone, and in that quiet moment, he remembers what Toph tried to teach him. She told him that earthbending is not only about seeing what is in front of you, it is about listening through the ground, feeling vibrations, and understanding what the earth is telling you. Aang has always relied on his eyes when he bends. But this time he closes himself off from sight and focuses on sensing. Deep beneath the city, through the stone and soil, he finally hears something. Appa. Aang immediately goes searching for help and learns about an underground prison hidden beneath Ba Sing Se. When he goes to inspect the area, he finds Iroh there as well. Iroh has discovered that Zuko has been arrested, and he knows of a secret entrance built long ago by Avatar Kyoshi herself. There is only one problem. The entrance can only be opened using all 4 elements. With Iroh providing fire, Aang is able to complete the requirement, and together they make their way inside. They find and rescue Sokka first, then continue deeper until they reach the cell holding Katara and Zuko. Katara had never known the true identity of the masked figure who helped her before. So when she learns that the blue spirit was actually Zuko all along, her anger explodes. Zuko does not make excuses. He tells her directly that he wants to change. He wants to become a better person. And strangely, the way he says it feels honest enough that Katara starts to believe him. Then Zuko opens up about his scar. He explains that fire does not truly burn a firebender unless that firebender allows it to. And the reason his father's flame scarred him so badly is because, deep down, Zuko believed he deserved the punishment. Katara has been carrying the spirit oasis water with her, saving it for a moment that truly matters. Listening to Zuko, seeing the pain beneath all his anger, she almost decides to use it on him. For one brief moment, it seems like she might heal his scar, but before she can do anything, they are interrupted. And just like that, Zuko's redemption falls apart almost as soon as it begins. After sneaking into Ba Sing Se disguised as one of the Kyoshi warriors, Azula quickly figures out the truth of the city. The Earth King may wear the crown, but he is not the one holding real power. So Azula creates her own opportunity. She causes a scene in the marketplace by using firebending openly, allowing the Dai Li to arrest her and bring her straight to Long Feng. Once face-to-face with him, she offers a deal. If Long Feng helps her capture the Avatar and Zuko, she will help him remove everyone standing in the way of his control over Ba Sing Se. Long Feng accepts. He has General Sung arrested, clearing away one of his biggest threats. But then he makes the fatal mistake of bringing Azula with him to speak before the Earth Kingdom Council. Azula was never planning to serve Long Feng's agenda. She does not want to help him protect his power. She wants the entire kingdom for herself, so she kills the council members and takes command of the Dai Li. Long Feng realizes far too late that he has handed control of Ba Sing Se to someone colder, smarter, and far more dangerous than he ever was. When Aang later crosses paths with Long Feng trying to escape the city, Long Feng tells him what Azula has done. The coup is already unfolding, and Ba Sing Se is collapsing from the inside. Azula then finds Zuko and offers him the one thing he has been chasing from the very beginning, a path back home, his banishment erased, his honor restored, his place in the Fire Nation returned. Ba Sing Se has already fallen into their hands, and all Zuko has to do is stand beside her. And after coming so close to choosing the right path, Zuko gives in almost immediately. He turns against Team Avatar. With Azula controlling the Dai Li and her allies already inside the city walls, the battle becomes overwhelming fast. Toph manages to escape the metal cage. Her mother locked her inside by bending the metal itself, becoming the first earthbender to ever do it. She joins the fight, but even her incredible new ability cannot overcome the sheer number of enemies surrounding them. Aang is pushed to the edge and enters the Avatar state. His power surges, forcing their enemies back. For a moment it looks like he may be able to stop Azula, but when he gets the chance to end the fight, he hesitates. Azula does not. She strikes him directly through the chest with lightning. Iroh steps in and holds Zuko and Azula back long enough for Katara to reach Aang and escape with him. Appa, finally free, carries Team Avatar into the sky as Ba Sing Se falls beneath them. Katara takes out the spirit oasis water and uses every last drop on Aang, desperately trying to save him, but the season refuses to give a clear answer. Aang comes back for only a brief moment, then slips unconscious again. And the danger is bigger than anyone realizes. Aang was struck while in the Avatar state. If he dies now, the entire Avatar cycle could be broken forever. As Team Avatar vanishes into the distance, the Fire Nation army marches into Ba Sing Se. The great city has fallen, and Fire Lord Oz has just secured the biggest victory of the 100-Year War. So the easiest way to describe Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender, is this. It's not a disaster, but it's also not the grand victory lap fans were probably hoping for. And honestly, that's where the show lives for most of its first season, somewhere in the middle. Sometimes it looks genuinely impressive, sometimes it feels like the people behind it really do care about this world, and then other times you can feel the cracks. The acting gets shaky, the writing gets too heavy, the pacing either rushes through something important or slows down in places where it should be moving with more energy. But I don't want to pretend there's nothing here, because there is. As a fantasy series, it does work on a basic level. The world is interesting, the elemental bending gives the show a strong visual identity, and there are enough strong moments sprinkled through the season to keep it from feeling like a waste of time. It has atmosphere, it has scale, it has that big adventure feeling in flashes, even if it doesn't always hold on to it for long. The strange thing is, I never felt like the show was completely falling apart. It's more like it keeps almost getting there. You'll have a scene where the visuals look great, or a character moment that starts to land emotionally, and you think, okay, now we're getting into it. Then suddenly the dialogue gets stiff, or the scene explains too much, or the energy drops, and you're reminded that this version still hasn't fully found its rhythm. That's probably the most frustrating part. It's not bad enough to dismiss, but it's not strong enough to fully celebrate either. If you're coming into this as someone who has never watched the animated series, I can see this being a pretty solid fantasy watch. You get the simple but effective setup. A lost avatar, a world out of balance, a violent fire nation, and a young hero who has to grow into a responsibility much bigger than himself. That stuff works. It's easy to follow, easy to get invested in, and the season does a decent job giving you enough reason to keep watching. But if you grew up with the original, or even if you watched it recently, this live-action version has a much harder battle. Because the animated show had this rare mix of humor, emotion, adventure, and character growth that felt effortless, this one feels like it's trying, sometimes trying very hard. And you can respect the effort, but you can also feel the weight of it. There are moments where the show feels too careful, too polished, too serious, almost like it's afraid to relax and just let the characters breathe. And that matters because Avatar was never only about the plot. It was about the journey, the friendships, the small jokes, the quiet moments between big battles, the feeling that these kids were not just running from one major event to the next, but actually growing together. This version understands the story, mostly, but it doesn't always understand the pulse of the story. Still, I'd be lying if I said I didn't find parts of it enjoyable. The season has enough visual spectacle, enough sincere performances, and enough respect for the source material to make it worth talking about. It's not the lifeless failure some people feared, and it's definitely a step above that old live-action movie everyone tries not to think about for too long. But at the same time, it's not the kind of adaptation that makes the original feel replaced. Not even close. For me, this first season feels like a foundation. A rough one maybe, but not a broken one. There's potential here. You can see where the show could improve if the writing becomes sharper, if the actors grow more comfortable, if the story slows down just enough to let the characters feel human, instead of constantly pushing them through plot points. So overall, Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender, is a solid but uneven start. It has heart but not always enough. It has spectacle but not always magic. It has respect for the original, but it still hasn't fully captured what made that original feel so alive. And maybe that's the fairest verdict. It's a good watch, but not yet a great one. Here's the thing with Avatar, The Last Airbender. This was never going to be judged like a normal fantasy show. It just wasn't. Netflix wasn't adapting some forgotten cartoon that people vaguely remembered from childhood. They were touching one of those rare shows that fans talk about like it changed the weather in their brain. And honestly, for a lot of people, it kind of did. The original animated series has that almost dangerous reputation where every episode, every joke, every character beat, every emotional moment has been rewatched, quoted, defended, and basically protected by fans for years. So before this live-action version even begins, it's already carrying baggage, not just expectations. Baggage, because when a story is already loved that much, the question is no longer, is this good? The question becomes, why does this need to exist? And that is a much harder question to answer. You can feel that pressure all over the first season. Sometimes it feels like the show is trying very carefully not to upset anyone. It wants to honor the animation. It wants to keep the major story beats. It wants the costumes to look familiar, the bending to feel recognizable, the characters to remind you of the versions you already love. And I get it. If they changed too much, fans would have torn it apart for disrespecting the source. But if you don't change enough, then you run into the other problem. You're just asking people to compare you to a version that already worked better. That's the trap this show is stuck in. The animated series had the freedom to be funny, weird, emotional, spiritual, childish, mature, and adventurous all at once. It could move from a goofy Sokka moment to something genuinely tragic without feeling like the tone had snapped in half. That balance is incredibly difficult to recreate in live action, especially when everything suddenly has real faces, real costumes, real sets, and a much heavier sense of seriousness. And to be fair, the Netflix version does not feel careless. That's important. You can tell there is respect here. This isn't some lazy cash grab where nobody understands the appeal. The people involved clearly know they are dealing with something important. The problem is that respect alone does not create magic. Sometimes, the show feels like it is carrying the original on its back instead of walking beside it. That's why even the good moments come with a little asterisk. A bending scene looks cool, but maybe it doesn't feel as fluid as your memory of the animation. A character says something emotional, but maybe the animated version already said it better with less dialogue. A familiar scene appears, and part of you enjoys seeing it recreated, while another part of you thinks, yeah, but I already had the perfect version of this. And that's a brutal position for any adaptation to be in. Because the original Avatar is not just liked, it's trusted. Fans trust those characters. They trust that journey. They trust the emotional rhythm of that world. So when the live-action version alters something, even slightly, it doesn't feel like a random creative choice. It feels personal to people. That might sound dramatic, but that's what happens when a show becomes part of someone's childhood. This adaptation was always going to have to fight for every inch of goodwill, and in some places, it earns it. In others, it reminds you exactly why people were nervous in the first place. So yeah, the impossible pressure is real. Netflix didn't just have to make a decent fantasy series. They had to stand next to a beloved classic and somehow not look unnecessary. And that's where this first season struggles most. It's not fighting against bad source material. It's fighting against something that already felt complete. Now we can't talk about Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender, without addressing the ghost standing in the corner, the 2010 movie. And look, I know everyone has already taken turns beating that movie into the ground. At this point, criticizing it almost feels like bullying a corpse. But the reason it keeps coming up is simple. That film left a mark, not a good one. For a lot of fans, it became the worst-case scenario for what happens when you take a beloved animated story and drain every ounce of life out of it. So when Netflix announced another live-action version, people weren't just skeptical, they were traumatized. And that's probably the one area where the 2024 series has an easy win. Whatever problems this show has, and it definitely has problems, it is still miles better than the 2010 version. It actually looks like someone watched the animated series this time. It understands the basic shape of the world. It knows the characters are supposed to have personality. It knows bending should feel exciting. It knows the Fire Nation, the Water Tribe, the Air Nomads, all of that needs to feel like part of a bigger living universe. That sounds like a low bar, and honestly it kind of is. But after that movie, even basic respect for the material feels like a relief. The Netflix version at least tries to make the world feel grand. The bending has weight. The costumes and sets are recognizable. The mythology is treated with some level of care. Aang isn't just a blank-faced chosen one being pushed through scenes. Zuko actually gets emotional focus. Iroh gets moments of warmth and wisdom, even if not all of them land perfectly. Ozai feels like a real presence instead of just a name waiting in the background. So yes, compared to the movie, this series is absolutely an improvement. But here's the tricky part. Being better than the 2010 movie doesn't automatically make it great. That's where some of the praise gets complicated. Because a lot of the time, people defend this show by saying, well, at least it's not that movie. And sure, fair, it isn't, thank God, but eventually the show has to stand on its own. It can't survive forever just by pointing to a worse adaptation and saying, see, we did better than that. Because the real comparison was never only the 2010 film. The real comparison is the animated series. And that's where Netflix's version starts looking much more uneven. Against the movie, it feels respectful, energetic, and far more complete. Against the cartoon, it feels heavier, stiffer, and less emotionally natural. The movie failed because it misunderstood almost everything. The series is more frustrating because it understands a lot of things, but still struggles to make them feel alive. That's a very different kind of disappointment. The 2010 movie was the kind of adaptation where you sit there wondering how so many obvious things went wrong. The Netflix show is the kind where you can see the good intentions, you can see the money on screen, you can see the actors trying, but you still find yourself thinking, why isn't this hitting harder? And in a strange way, that makes this version harder to dismiss, because it's not a disaster. It's not some soulless wreck that you can just laugh off and move on from. It has enough good pieces to make you want it to work. It gives fans actual moments to enjoy. It gives newcomers a much cleaner entry point into the story. It proves that a live-action Avatar doesn't have to be embarrassing, but it also proves something else. Escaping the shadow of the 2010 movie is only step one. The bigger challenge is capturing the spirit of Avatar itself, and that's where this series is still finding its footing. So yes, Netflix cleared the lowest bar, easily. The problem is, Avatar was never supposed to be judged by the lowest bar. The basic setup of Avatar, The Last Airbender, is still one of the cleanest fantasy premises you can ask for. You have a world divided by 4 elements: water, earth, fire, and air. Each nation has people who can bend one of those elements, shape it, fight with it, live through it. And then above all of them, there is the Avatar, the one person who can master all 4 and keep balance between the nations. Simple idea, big playground. And that's probably why this story has always worked so well. You don't need a 20-minute lecture to understand the conflict. The Fire Nation has become too powerful. The world is out of balance. The one person who was supposed to stop that disappeared for 100 years. And when he finally comes back, he is not some battle-hardened warrior with perfect control over destiny. He's a kid. That detail matters more than anything. Aang isn't introduced as this mighty, untouchable savior. He wakes up after a century frozen in ice, and the world he knew is basically gone. His people are gone. The Fire Nation has spread its influence everywhere. The war has already damaged generations of people before he even gets a chance to understand what happened. So right away, the show has a strong emotional hook underneath the fantasy mechanics. Yes, it is about bending elements, battles, tribes, nations, and magical destiny. But really, it is about a child being handed a responsibility that would crush most adults. That's the part the live-action version does understand, at least on paper. The world itself has enough texture to pull you in. The Water Tribe has its own identity. The Fire Nation feels aggressive and organized. The Air Nomads carry this tragic sense of absence because we are introduced to them through what was lost. And the idea of one avatar connecting all of these worlds gives the story a natural sense of movement. Every new place can reveal a new culture, a new wound from the war, or a new piece of Aang's role. That is strong fantasy storytelling, and the show does benefit from how clear the central journey is. Aang has to learn the elements. Katara and Sokka join him. The Fire Nation wants him captured or destroyed. Zuko is hunting him for his own reasons. Everyone is moving toward something. Even if the season sometimes rushes, the spine of the story is never confusing. You always understand what is at stake. The Fire Nation is not just some random villain army in the background. Their domination has changed the shape of the world. Villages are afraid, cultures are damaged, families are separated. People have built their entire lives around surviving a war that started long before many of them were born. So when Aang returns, his arrival does not feel small. It feels like a myth suddenly becoming real again. That's a great engine for a show. Where the live-action version becomes uneven is in how it delivers that world. The premise is powerful, but sometimes the show explains it too neatly. Characters will say the important thing out loud when the scene could have trusted the audience to feel it. The world is already interesting. The bending already tells us so much. The ruins, the costumes, the fear of the Fire Nation, the way people react to hearing the Avatar is back, all of that can speak for itself. But even with those issues, the foundation still works. Because Avatar has the kind of story that naturally pulls you forward. A lost hero, a broken world, elemental powers, a war that feels bigger than any single character, a villainous nation with personal conflicts inside it, a young team that has to grow before they are ready. That's why even when the adaptation stumbles, the premise keeps it alive. The show may not always capture the full magic of the original, but the world of Avatar is still strong enough to survive the transition. You can feel why people love this universe. You can see why newcomers get pulled in. And even when the execution gets messy, the core idea remains incredibly watchable. A world out of balance, a boy who disappeared. A war that never stopped, and one avatar who has to grow up fast enough to save everyone. This is one of the weirdest things about Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender. Your reaction to it probably depends a lot on what you brought with you before pressing play. Because if you're coming into this world fresh, with no childhood attachment, no memory of the animated series, no favorite episode sitting in the back of your mind, I can honestly see the show working much better. You get a big fantasy setup, elemental powers, a lost hero, a dangerous Fire Nation, a young team traveling through a war-torn world. There's enough action, enough visual spectacle, and enough mythology to make it feel like a solid adventure series. Maybe not flawless, but easy to watch, easy to binge, easy to enjoy without constantly pausing in your head to compare every scene to something else. And that matters. A newcomer doesn't necessarily care if a character's personality has been softened. They don't know what joke was removed. They don't know which storyline was combined with another one, or which emotional beat used to land harder in animation. They're not sitting there thinking, wait, why is this happening so early? Or that moment used to mean more. They're just watching the story unfold. And from that angle, the Netflix version has a decent amount going for it. The premise is strong, the bending looks cool, the world is easy to understand, and the season gives you a clear reason to keep moving forward. If this is your first real introduction to Avatar, I can understand finishing the 8 episodes and thinking, yeah, that was pretty good. I'd watch more. But for longtime fans, it's a completely different experience. Because they're not just watching what's on screen, they're also feeling what's missing. That's where the adaptation starts to struggle. Fans of the animated series remember the warmth, they remember the humor. They remember how Aang, Katara, and Sokka slowly became a little found family, instead of just 3 characters running from one plot point to the next. They remember how the show could be silly one minute and emotionally devastating the next without making either side feel cheap. So when the live-action version rushes through a moment, or flattens a character, or replaces playful energy with serious dialogue, fans notice immediately. And I get why that becomes frustrating. The original wasn't loved just because the story was good. It was loved because of how that story breathed. The little pauses mattered, the jokes mattered, the awkward kid behavior mattered. Even the episodes that felt smaller on the surface were often building the relationships that made the bigger moments hit later. The Netflix version sometimes feels like it understands the plot better than it understands the experience of watching the original. That's probably why the reaction has been so split. New viewers may see a polished fantasy show with strong effects and a cool world. Longtime fans may see an adaptation that keeps the skeleton but loses some of the heartbeat. Neither reaction is fake. It's just 2 completely different ways of watching. There are also fans who are somewhere in the middle, people who love the original but still went in with an open mind. They may enjoy seeing bending in live action. They may appreciate Zuko's material, or the Fire Nation scenes, or the effort put into the visuals. But even then, there's usually that small voice in the background saying, this is fine, but the original did it better. And that is the adaptation's biggest problem. Not that it's impossible to enjoy. It is enjoyable in places. But if you already know how rich this story can feel, then the live-action version often feels like a good-looking version of something deeper. For newcomers, it may be an entry point. For fans, it feels more like a test of patience, nostalgia, fairness, and how much change you're willing to accept before the thing you love starts feeling a little too different. So I don't think there's one clean answer here. If this is your first trip into the world of Avatar, Netflix gives you enough to be entertained. But if you grew up with the animated series, this version is harder to embrace without reservation. Because you're not just asking, is this good? You're asking, does this still feel like Avatar? And depending on what the original meant to you, the answer might change from episode to episode. The Netflix version of Avatar. The Last Airbender is in a strange position, because in a lot of ways, it really is trying to be faithful. You can see that almost immediately. This is not an adaptation that throws the whole thing out and says, don't worry, we know better. It follows the same basic journey. Aang is still the lost avatar. Katara and Sokka still find him. The Fire Nation is still the threat hanging over the world. Zuko is still chasing the Avatar with that wounded intensity, and the larger shape of Book 1 is still very recognizable. So if we're talking about surface-level faithfulness, the show does a decent job. It recreates familiar locations. It brings back important characters. It includes side stories and moments that fans will instantly recognize. You can feel the creators looking back at the animated series and trying to honor what was already there. Even some smaller callbacks are clearly designed to make longtime viewers smile, like the Cabbage Merchant moment or certain beats pulled directly from the original. And honestly, that kind of effort matters. After the damage done by the previous live-action movie, just seeing a version that actually respects the names, the mythology, the nations, and the basic emotional direction of the story feels like a relief. The Netflix series understands that this world has rules. It understands that bending isn't just a random superpower. It understands that Aang's return means something bigger than just one kid waking up from ice. But faithfulness is complicated, because sometimes the show keeps the story but changes the feeling, and that's where things get messy. A scene can be technically similar to the animated version and still not hit the same way. A character can wear the right costume, say the right kind of line, stand in the right place, and somehow still feel slightly off. That's the difficult part of adapting something like Avatar. You can copy the map, but if the emotional rhythm is wrong, the journey still feels different. The show also makes changes that are understandable in theory. It has only 8 episodes, so it has to combine material. It has to move faster. It has to reshape certain events so they fit a live-action season. I don't think every change is automatically bad. Some of them are clearly made because Netflix is trying to create bigger, denser episodes instead of copying the cartoon beat for beat. But not every change lands. At times, the season feels like it is pulling pieces from different parts of the original and forcing them into one place before the characters have earned them. Stories get merged. Characters appear earlier than expected. Certain arcs are shortened or softened. And because of that, some moments that should feel important end up feeling like they were added just because fans would recognize them. That's not the same thing as storytelling. The biggest issue is that the animated series had patience. It could let characters grow slowly. It could let a joke breathe. It could spend time on a small adventure that seemed light but quietly built a relationship. The Netflix version, while mostly loyal to the main plot, often skips that texture. It keeps the big events but trims the connective tissue. And that connective tissue was a huge part of why the original worked. So yes, the show is faithful in many visible ways. It respects the world. It tries to preserve the major story. It wants to satisfy fans rather than insult them. That puts it in a much better place than a careless adaptation. But being faithful is not just about what happens. It's about why it matters. That's where this version still struggles. It remembers the outline, but it doesn't always capture the personality. It recreates the journey, but it rushes through some of the feeling. It brings the animated series to live action, but sometimes you can feel the soul slipping between the scenes, so I wouldn't call it unfaithful. That feels too harsh. It's more like a respectful adaptation that occasionally misunderstands what needed protecting the most, not just the plot points, not just the costumes, not just the bending, the warmth, the looseness, the little imperfections in the characters. The sense that this was a story about kids growing up together inside a world at war. That is the version fans remember. And that is the version Netflix is still trying to fully reach, at some point with Netflix's Avatar. The Last Airbender, you run into the question every live-action remake of a beloved animated story has to answer. Why not can this be made? Because obviously it can. Netflix has the money, the technology is better now, bending can look impressive on screen, and there's a massive fan base ready to click the moment the title appears. From a business angle, I get it, completely. A famous name, built-in nostalgia, fantasy action, younger characters, global appeal. Of course, somebody looked at that and said, yeah, let's do it again. But creatively, the question is harder. Because the original animated series is still right there. It hasn't disappeared. It hasn't aged into something unwatchable. It's not one of those old shows where you say, okay, maybe the idea was great, but the execution needs a modern update. The original still works, the humor still works, the emotional scenes still work. The world still feels rich. The characters still feel alive. So the live-action version is not just competing with memory. It is competing with something people can rewatch today and still love. That puts this adaptation in a really awkward position. If it follows the original too closely, you start wondering why you wouldn't just watch the animated version. If it changes too much, fans ask why it even bothered calling itself Avatar. There's almost no comfortable lane for it. It either feels unnecessary or risky, and sometimes it feels like it knows that. You can sense the show trying to justify itself through scale, bigger visuals, more serious tone, heavier drama, more cinematic bending, more direct conflict. It wants to say, look, this is Avatar with the weight of live action. This is the version you imagined when you were younger. And in certain moments, I understand the appeal. Seeing the elements brought to life can be exciting. Seeing familiar locations with real sets and effects has its own charm. There is something satisfying about watching a childhood fantasy world become physical, but that novelty only carries the show so far. After the first wave of recognition fades, the series has to offer something that feels necessary. And that's where it struggles. Too often, it feels like it is retelling a story that already had better timing, better character chemistry, and a clearer emotional rhythm. It has the look of a prestige fantasy series, but the reason for its existence never becomes fully convincing. And I don't think that means the show is worthless. That would be too simple. There are people who will discover Avatar through this version. There are viewers who don't watch animation, or who never gave the original a chance, and for them, this might be the door into the world. That counts for something. A live-action adaptation can bring a story to a new audience, and this one does have enough strong material to make that possible. But for fans who already know the animated series, the live-action version has to do more than exist. It has to add something, not just extra scenes, not just more exposition, not just darker lighting and bigger fire blasts. It has to make you feel like this version has a reason to stand beside the original. And right now, I'm not sure it fully does. That's probably why the show can feel so frustrating even when it's decent. If it were terrible, the conversation would be easy. We would all point at it, complain for a week, and move on. But because it's competent, because it has effort behind it, because some parts genuinely work, it becomes harder to dismiss. You end up watching it and thinking, okay, this is not bad, but why am I watching this instead of the version that already nailed the same material? That question keeps following the season. It follows the serious tone. It follows the rushed character arcs. It follows the scenes that recreate familiar moments but don't quite hit the same emotional note. It follows every moment where the show seems proud of simply translating something into live action, as if translation itself is enough. And maybe for some viewers, it is enough. Maybe seeing bending in live action, seeing Aang and Zuko and Katara and Sokka as real people, seeing the Fire Nation and Water Tribe rebuilt with modern effects, maybe that is the appeal. I can respect that. There's nothing wrong with wanting to see a beloved world through a different lens. But for me, the remake still feels like it is searching for its own purpose. It proves that a live-action Avatar can be watchable. It proves that the material can survive outside animation better than the 2010 movie suggested. But it does not yet prove that this version needed to exist as anything more than another version. And that's the real challenge going forward. Not just to be faithful, not just to be better than the old movie, but to become something that feels essential in its own right. Because when the original is already great, not bad is not enough of a reason. One of the biggest problems with Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender, is that the show always feels like it's in a hurry. Not constantly in a fun, exciting, we're on an adventure kind of way. More like the season has a checklist hidden behind the camera, and every episode is trying to cross off as much as possible before the credits roll. You can feel the Netflix structure working against the story. The animated version had room. It could take a small detour. It could let the characters get lost somewhere. It could spend an episode on a side adventure that didn't seem massive at first, but later you realized it had quietly built the bond between Aang, Katara, and Sokka. Those little episodes mattered. They gave the world texture. They let the characters be funny, annoying, immature, brave, selfish, kind, basically human. The live-action version doesn't have that luxury, or at least it acts like it doesn't. With only 8 episodes, the show tries to fold a lot of material into bigger, longer chapters. On paper, that probably sounds smart. Take multiple animated episodes, combine the important parts, give everything a larger cinematic shape, and keep the story moving for modern streaming audiences. I understand the logic. Nobody wants a live-action season that feels like it's wandering around aimlessly. But Avatar is not a story that works only because of big plot movement. It works because of the small things between the big plot movement. That's what this version keeps losing. A character shows up, and before they can really settle into the story, we're already being pushed toward the next location. A major emotional beat happens, but the show doesn't always give it enough silence afterward. Storylines from different parts of the original are pulled together, and sometimes they technically connect, but emotionally they feel cramped. It's like the writers are so afraid of boring the audience that they never let the audience sit with anything. And weirdly, that makes the show feel slower sometimes, because rushing plot does not automatically create momentum. If anything, too much compression can make a season feel heavy. You get long conversations explaining what matters, characters spelling out their pain, exposition being stacked on top of exposition, and suddenly the show feels dense instead of exciting. It's moving fast but not breathing. That's the strange contradiction here. The season is rushed, but it can still feel draggy. It races through character development, but then pauses for dialogue that says what the development should have shown. It pushes through major events, but some scenes still feel overloaded. It wants to have action movie pacing, but Avatar was never just an action story. It was a travel story, a friendship story, a coming-of-age story. A war story, yes, but one told through kids who were still allowed to be kids. This version often feels panic-stricken, like it's scared someone might click away if Aang and the group spend too long just existing together. And I think that's a mistake, because the original did not become beloved because every minute was plot efficient. It became beloved because the characters had space to grow. Sokka could be rude or sarcastic and then slowly mature. Katara could struggle, argue, hope, and become stronger. Aang could be playful one moment and crushed by grief the next. Those shifts need time. They can't just be squeezed between the next big location and the next visual effects scene. The compression also hurts the world building. The world of Avatar is supposed to feel huge, but when the show jumps too quickly from one storyline to another, the world can start to feel smaller. Places become stops on a route instead of cultures with their own rhythm. Supporting characters become reminders of things fans recognize rather than people who fully live inside the story. And that's frustrating because you can see the potential. When the show slows down even a little, it improves. The stronger later episodes suggest that this adaptation can work when it lets a moment land. Certain scenes with Zuko, Iroh, or the Fire Nation side have more weight because they aren't always rushing toward the next familiar event. They have a little more space to build tension, a little more patience. That's what the whole season needed, not 20 episodes necessarily. I understand that live action is expensive. You can't just copy the animated structure one for one and expect it to work the same way. But 8 episodes feels too tight for what this story is trying to carry. 10 episodes might have helped. 12 would have helped even more. Just enough extra room for the characters to breathe, joke, fail, bond, and become more than pieces being moved across the plot. Because right now, the season often feels like it is adapting the memory of Book 1 rather than the full experience of it. It remembers the important stops. It just forgets that the journey between them was the point. The more I watched Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender, the more I kept thinking the same thing. This season needed more room, not necessarily a massive 20-episode run like the animated show. I get why that was never realistic. Live action is expensive. Every bending scene costs money. Every creature, set, costume, location, and battle has to be built in a way animation doesn't have to worry about in the same way. So no, I wasn't expecting Netflix to recreate the original structure episode for episode, but 8 episodes, that feels tight, too tight, and you can feel it in the way the season moves. It's not just that events happen quickly, it's that the characters don't always get the time they need after those events happen. They go through something emotional, then the story is already dragging them into the next major plot point. A new location appears, a familiar character is introduced, a conflict starts, and before the atmosphere can really settle, we're off again. It makes the world feel busy instead of expansive. That's a problem because Avatar is supposed to feel like a journey. You're supposed to feel the distance between places. You're supposed to feel the group becoming closer through travel, danger, boredom, arguments, jokes, and random little detours. The original understood that the road mattered just as much as the destination. This version often feels like it only has time for the destination, and honestly, that hurts the main trio the most. Aang, Katara, and Sokka need breathing room more than anyone else. They're kids. They shouldn't just be delivering plot information and reacting to trauma every few scenes. They need those small, slightly messy moments where they irritate each other, laugh at something stupid, make mistakes, and slowly become a family. That kind of bond can't be rushed. You can tell the show wants us to feel their friendship, but it doesn't always let us experience it. It tells us they care. It places them together. It gives them shared danger. But friendship in a story like this is built in the quieter spaces. The scenes where nothing huge is technically happening, but everything important is happening underneath. A little more time could have changed so much. A 10-episode season might have allowed certain storylines to land more naturally. 12 episodes could have given the showroom to separate some of the combined plots. Even 13 episodes would probably have made the whole thing feel less panicked, not slower in a boring way, slower in a human way, because there's a difference between pacing and patience. A show can move forward while still letting characters breathe. It can keep stakes high without turning every episode into a compressed package of major moments. It can trust that viewers will stay invested because they care about the people, not just because another big thing is happening every 10 minutes. That's where Netflix's version sometimes seems unsure of itself. It feels like it's afraid that if the story pauses, the audience will leave. But with Avatar, those pauses are part of the magic. Aang being playful matters. Sokka making a bad joke matters. Katara getting frustrated matters. Iroh quietly giving advice over tea matters. These are not distractions from the story. They are the story. And when you cut too many of them, the big emotional moments don't have the same weight. You can have all the bending you want. You can have great effects, big music, dramatic speeches, and a polished fantasy world. But if the characters haven't had enough time to feel lived in, then the spectacle starts carrying more weight than the emotions. And that's not where Avatar is strongest. The show needed breathing room to let Aang's grief feel deeper, to let Katara's growth feel earned, to let Sokka's humor and insecurity actually shape him, to let Zuko's obsession build with more tension, to let the world feel like a place being discovered, not just a series of required stops. That doesn't mean everything in the season fails. Some episodes work better than others. Some moments do manage to slow down and connect, but the structure keeps pulling the show forward before it can fully enjoy its own world. And that's frustrating because the fix feels obvious. More time, not endless time, not filler for the sake of filler, just enough space for the story to inhale before the next fire blast, the next speech, the next chase, the next dramatic reveal. Because this first season has the bones of a strong adaptation. It has the setup, it has the world, it has characters people already want to love, but it keeps squeezing them into a season shape that feels too small for the story being told. And by the end, I didn't feel like the show lacked ambition. I felt like it lacked air. The pacing in Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender, is one of those problems that doesn't always hit you in one obvious way. It's not simply too fast, and it's not simply too slow. Somehow, it manages to be both. There are episodes where the show feels like it's sprinting through major events, throwing characters, locations, conflicts, and emotional reveals at us before we've had enough time to really settle into any of them. Then, almost immediately after that, you'll get these long stretches of dialogue where everything slows down, but not in a natural or emotional way, more in a characters standing around explaining what the scene already told us kind of way. That's what makes the pacing feel uneven. It rushes the wrong things and lingers on the wrong things. The original animated series had a rhythm that made its world feel alive. Some episodes were big and important, sure, but others were smaller. Some were goofy, some were strange, some felt like little side quests, and at the time, you might not even realize how much they were doing for the characters. But later, when the emotional stakes got heavier, all those little moments paid off. The Netflix version doesn't always have that rhythm. It feels more anxious. Like every episode is trying to prove it matters, and that creates this crowded feeling. Instead of letting one storyline breathe, the show will often stack multiple ideas together. A familiar character appears, then another one, then a new location, then a piece of backstory, then a dramatic speech, then an action sequence. It's a lot, and again, some of it is good on its own. But when it's packed together too tightly, the emotional impact starts to blur. You don't always get the satisfaction of discovery. You get the feeling of being moved along. That's especially noticeable in the middle stretch of the season. There are parts where the show seems to be combining too many stories at once, and instead of feeling rich, it feels messy. You can see the ambition, but you can also see the strain. It wants to honor so much from the original that it sometimes forgets to shape those pieces into something that flows naturally as live action. And then the slower moments don't always help, because a lot of them are filled with exposition. That's the frustrating part. If the show slowed down to let the characters joke, argue, bond, or quietly process what they're going through, I'd be completely fine with that. In fact, that's exactly what it needed more of. But too often, the slower scenes are not really character scenes. They're explanation scenes. People talk about destiny. They talk about responsibility. They talk about pain. They talk about what they're feeling instead of letting us feel it with them. So the season ends up in this awkward place where the plot feels rushed, but the scenes can still feel heavy. And that is not a great combination. When the pacing works, though, you can feel the show become more confident. Some of the later episodes have stronger momentum because the stakes are clearer and the emotional focus tightens. The Northern Water Tribe material, for example, has more of that end-of-season weight. You can tell the show is finally building towards something instead of constantly trying to introduce or rearrange things. But even there, not everything lands as hard as it should. Some viewers found the finale fitting, others found it flat. And honestly, I can understand both reactions. The pieces are there, the scale is there, the visuals are there. But because the season has not always given enough time to the relationships and emotional buildup, the ending doesn't hit with the full force it could have had. That's the thing about pacing. It's not just about speed, it's about timing. It's about knowing when to move, when to pause, when to trust silence, when to let a joke sit, when to let a character fail without immediately explaining the lesson, and when to let the audience connect the dots on their own. This adaptation sometimes feels like it doesn't trust those pauses. It wants to keep the story moving, which I understand. But Avatar is not a story that becomes better just because it moves faster. The adventure needs motion, yes, but it also needs breath. It needs those softer spaces between the big moments, because that's where the characters become more than names from the original. By the end of the season, the pacing doesn't ruin the show completely, but it does keep getting in the way. It keeps strong scenes from becoming great scenes. It keeps emotional moments from fully settling. It makes the world feel smaller than it should, and most importantly, it makes the journey feel more like a condensed retelling than a lived experience. And for Avatar, that difference matters a lot. One thing that really starts to weigh down Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender, is how much the show talks. And I don't mean normal dialogue. Obviously, characters need to speak. This is a fantasy world with history, politics, trauma, bending, war, destiny, spiritual balance. There's a lot to communicate. I get that. But there's a difference between dialogue that reveals character and dialogue that feels like it's explaining the episode to you while you're already watching it. This show falls into that second lane way too often. Characters will say exactly what they're feeling, then they'll explain why they're feeling it. Then another character will respond by explaining what that means for the story. And after a while, you start to feel like the writers don't fully trust the audience to understand anything unless someone says it out loud. That's frustrating because Avatar is already a very visual story. The world can tell us so much by itself. Aang standing in the ruins of what used to be his home tells us more than a speech ever could. Zuko's silence around Iroh can say more about pain and shame than another line about honor. Katara watching someone suffer under the Fire Nation should not always need extra explanation. The bending, the costumes, the destroyed villages, the fear people carry, all of that is storytelling. But the show keeps adding words on top of it. And after a point, those words start flattening the emotion instead of deepening it. There are scenes where you can almost see the stronger version underneath. A character moment begins. The mood is there. The music is there. The actor is trying to hold something back. And then the script steps in and has them say the thing directly, sometimes in the most formal way possible. It's like the show is afraid of subtext. That's where the dialogue can feel stiff. Not every line is bad, to be fair. There are moments that land. Some of the Fire Nation material works better because the tension is clearer and the performances give the words more weight. Zuko and Iroh, especially, get a few scenes where the dialogue actually has some emotional texture. You feel the history between them. You feel the regret and the pressure. But with the main trio, the writing often feels less natural. Aang, Katara, and Sokka should sound like kids who are scared, overwhelmed, excited, annoyed, and slowly becoming friends. Instead, they sometimes sound like they're delivering carefully prepared statements about courage, pain, responsibility, and destiny. Those are important ideas, sure, but when every emotion is announced, the characters stop feeling spontaneous. And that's a problem because the original Avatar had such a good ear for casual character rhythm. People joked, they interrupted each other, they said dumb things, they got defensive, they misunderstood each other, they acted like kids. Then, when the serious moments came, they hit harder because the characters didn't spend every scene speaking like they knew they were inside an important story. The live-action version feels more self-conscious. It wants everything to matter, so it makes everyone talk like everything matters. But if every conversation is heavy, then heaviness stops feeling special. The emotional moments need contrast. They need ordinary moments around them. They need humor. They need awkward pauses. They need characters not always having the perfect line for what the scene is about. That's what gives a story life. The exposition also affects the pacing. Sometimes the show is already rushing through major events, but then it slows down for long explanations. So instead of feeling fast and thrilling, the episode becomes dense. Plot-wise, we're moving quickly. Scene by scene, we're being stopped for another explanation of something we probably already understood. It's an odd combination, and maybe part of this comes from adaptation anxiety. The writers are dealing with a huge world, a passionate fanbase, and only 8 episodes. They probably felt pressure to make sure every major idea was clear, but clarity is not the same as emotional impact. You can explain a theme perfectly and still not make the audience feel it. That's where the show needs more confidence. Let Aang be quiet sometimes. Let Katara show frustration without turning it into a speech. Let Sokka hide insecurity behind actual humor instead of just functional dialogue. Let Zuko's anger sit in the room without immediately unpacking it. Let Iroh's wisdom come through behavior, not just advice. Trust the scene. Trust the actors, trust the audience, because the bones of the story are strong enough. We understand that Aang is carrying guilt. We understand that the Fire Nation is dangerous. We understand that Zuko wants honor. We understand that Katara wants to become stronger. We understand that Sokka is trying to protect people without having bending powers. The show doesn't need to underline every point. It needs to let those points breathe. And that's why the dialogue is such a big issue. It doesn't destroy the season, but it keeps reminding you that this adaptation is working too hard to explain a story that should feel more natural. It turns emotional beats into information. It turns character conflict into statements. It turns mystery into instruction. For a world as magical as Avatar, that's a shame. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a character can say is nothing at all. One of the things I missed most in Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender, wasn't a specific scene. It was the fun. And I know that sounds simple, maybe even a little unfair, because this version is clearly trying to take the story seriously. The Fire Nation is dangerous. Aang is carrying real grief. The world is at war. People are scared. There is trauma everywhere. So yes, a heavier tone makes sense in some places. But Avatar was never powerful because it was serious all the time. That was the magic of the original. It could be about genocide, war, destiny, grief, and spiritual balance, but it still remembered that the main characters were kids. They were awkward, they were silly, They made bad jokes, they got jealous, they argued over stupid things. They had fun even when the world around them was broken. The live-action version often forgets that. It feels like the show is so focused on making the story mature and important that it loses some of the warmth that made the original so easy to love. The humor is not completely gone, but it is definitely reduced. Sokka gets some comedic lines, sure, but a lot of them feel safer, softer, less sharp. Aang has moments of innocence, but not enough of that playful spark. Katara is written with so much seriousness that her softer, warmer side doesn't always come through naturally. And without that playfulness, the journey starts to feel heavier than it should. That matters because humor in Avatar was not just decoration. It was not there only to give the audience a break before the next dramatic moment. It was part of the character writing. Sokka's sarcasm told us who he was. Aang's goofy energy made his sadness hit harder. Katara's emotional reactions showed both her strength and her youth. Even Iroh's lightness, his tea obsession, his strange little jokes, his relaxed warmth, all of that made his wisdom feel human instead of preachy. When you remove too much of that, you don't just make the show more serious, you make it flatter. The characters begin to feel like they are constantly carrying the weight of the plot instead of living inside the world. They move from one tense conversation to another. They talk about responsibility, destiny, pain, and fear. And again, those themes belong here. But when they dominate too much, the show loses contrast. The emotional scenes need lighter moments around them. Otherwise, everything starts playing at the same level. It becomes exhausting in a quiet way. The original knew how to let the audience relax with these characters. It let us enjoy their company. That's why the darker moments worked. We cared because we had seen them laugh. We had seen them be annoying. We had seen them act like actual kids, not just symbolic figures in a fantasy war. This adaptation sometimes treats fun like it's less important than drama, but fun was part of the drama. That's why Sokka being rude, sarcastic, and immature mattered. That's why Aang wanting to avoid responsibility sometimes mattered. That's why the group just messing around mattered. These weren't random distractions. They were the pieces that made the characters feel alive before the story asked them to grow. And I think that's where this version could improve the most in future seasons. It doesn't need to become a comedy. It doesn't need to copy every joke from the animated series, but it does need to loosen up. Let the characters breathe. Let them tease each other. Let Sokka be a little more ridiculous. Let Aang be a child, not just the Avatar. Let Katara have moments that are not only built around concern or seriousness. Because right now, the show sometimes feels like it is afraid that too much humor will make the world less important. But with Avatar, the opposite is true. The humor makes the world more important because it reminds us what these characters are fighting to protect. Not just nations, not just balance, not just destiny. Life. The messy, warm, funny, imperfect life that exists between all the big dramatic speeches and battles. And that is the feeling this adaptation needs more of. Not just visual magic, not just bending, not just respect for the plot. Warmth. Because without that, Avatar still looks like Avatar, but it doesn't always feel like it. The thing about Avatar. The Last Airbender is that the adventure was never just about getting from one location to another. It was about the people traveling together. And that's one area where the Netflix version feels like it skips a few emotional steps. Aang, Katara, and Sokka are supposed to become this messy little found family. Not instantly, not perfectly, but slowly. They're supposed to irritate each other, protect each other, misunderstand each other, laugh at the wrong times, argue over dumb things, and then somehow keep choosing to stay together anyway. That's what makes the journey feel alive. In the live-action version, you understand that they are a team because the story tells you they are a team. They travel together, they face danger together, they share important conversations. But the bond itself doesn't always feel like it has enough space to grow naturally. It's there, but it feels thinner than it should, and I think a big reason is the lack of downtime. The original animated series had room for moments that didn't seem huge on the surface. Small jokes, random detours, weird side adventures, Sokka being dramatic over something silly, Aang getting distracted because he's still a kid, Katara getting frustrated because she's trying to hold everyone together. Those scenes weren't filler in the lazy sense. They were the glue. This version cuts a lot of that glue. So what happens is, the characters keep moving through plot, but they don't always feel like they're living with each other. They feel assigned to the same quest more than emotionally bonded by it. And that matters because when the show later asks us to care about their friendship, it hasn't always done enough of the everyday work that makes that friendship believable. You need the quiet scenes. You need the silly scenes. You need the scenes where nobody is explaining destiny or trauma or war, and the characters are just being young, awkward, tired, annoyed, or excited. That's how you make the audience feel like they know them. not just as heroes, but as people. The live-action version sometimes seems afraid of those pauses. It wants to keep pushing forward, maybe because it only has 8 episodes, maybe because it's trying to hold the attention of a streaming audience, maybe because it thinks serious fantasy needs to constantly remind us of the stakes. But the stakes hit harder when you care about the group, and caring about the group comes from time spent with them. Ong especially needs that kind of space. He's not just the avatar. He's a boy who lost everything, but he's also still someone who wants to laugh, play, avoid pressure, and enjoy being alive. If the show only focuses on his burden, he starts feeling more like a symbol than a kid. And that weakens the tragedy, because Ong's sadness works best when it sits right beside his childish joy. Katara also needed more room. She can't just be the emotional center by default. We need to see her warmth, her anger, her stubbornness, her humor, her impatience, her growth. The show gives her serious material, but it doesn't always give her enough texture between those serious beats. And Sokka, honestly, Sokka might be hurt the most by this approach, because his personality depends so much on rhythm. His sarcasm, his insecurity, his overconfidence, his protectiveness, his bad jokes, all of that needs interaction. He needs people to bounce off. He needs awkward group moments. He needs time to be wrong, annoying, funny, and then slowly better. When the show softens him and also removes a lot of casual group banter, his arc loses some of its shape. That's the bigger issue here. The friendship doesn't feel completely absent, but it feels undercooked. There are moments where you can see the version this could become. A look here, a small exchange there, a bit of shared danger that starts to bring them closer. But then the story moves on too quickly. Instead of letting the chemistry build, it jumps back into the next important event. And for a show like Avatar, that is a costly trade. Because this story is not just about defeating the Fire Nation. It's about a group of kids becoming strong enough to face a broken world together. If we don't feel the friendship, the journey becomes more mechanical. The plot still works, the visuals still entertain, but the emotional engine is weaker. That's why I keep coming back to the same thought. The show needed more ordinary moments, not boring moments, ordinary ones. Moments where Ong, Katara, and Sokka feel like they exist outside the plot. Moments where they laugh when they shouldn't. Moments where they are scared but try to hide it. Moments where they start to understand each other without saying some big meaningful line. That's where real chemistry is built. And if future seasons want to capture more of what made Avatar special, this is one of the first things they need to fix. Slow down just enough. Let the group breathe. Let them be kids on a journey, not just characters carrying mythology from one episode to the next, because the world may be built on 4 elements, but the story is built on friendship. The acting in Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender, is one of those things I kept going back and forth on while watching, because I don't think the cast is lazy. That's not the problem. You can tell most of the actors are really trying to honor these characters. There's effort here. There's sincerity. Nobody feels like they walked onto set with zero respect for the material. And honestly, with a story this beloved, that matters. You want to feel like the people playing Ong, Katara, Sokka, Zuko, Iroh, and everyone else understand that fans are not just watching costumes and bending effects. They're watching characters they already have an emotional attachment to. But effort does not always equal a strong performance, and that's where the show becomes uneven. Some scenes work, some performances settle in better as the season goes on. There are moments where you can see the actors finding the rhythm of the world, especially when the writing gives them something more grounded to play. But then there are other scenes where the line delivery feels stiff, or too careful, or just slightly unnatural. Not always terrible, but noticeable enough that it pulls you out of the moment. And in a fantasy show, that can be dangerous, because the audience is already being asked to believe in bending, spirit worlds, flying bison, ancient wars, and nations built around elements. If the acting feels too wooden, the whole illusion gets weaker. Suddenly, instead of being inside the world, you're watching actors stand in costumes explaining the plot. That happened a few times for me. The younger cast especially has a tough job. I do want to be fair about that. These are not easy roles. Ong is not just a cheerful kid. He is carrying guilt, grief, innocence, fear, and destiny all at the same time. Katara has to be warm, strong, wounded, hopeful, and stubborn without becoming flat. Sokka has to be funny without turning into a cartoon, but also flawed enough that his growth means something. That is a lot to ask from young performers. And sometimes, the show asks even more by giving them dialogue that doesn't sound natural in the first place. When a script is full of exposition and serious speeches, even experienced actors can struggle to make it feel casual. So when the performances feel stiff, I don't think the blame sits only with the cast. The writing is part of it. The direction is part of it. The pressure of recreating iconic animated personalities is definitely part of it. Still, the unevenness is there. There are scenes where emotions should land harder, but the delivery feels too flat. There are moments that should feel playful, but the timing isn't sharp enough. Some interactions feel rehearsed rather than lived in. And because the original animated series was so expressive, the comparison becomes even more brutal. Animation allowed those characters to have huge faces, fast reactions, exaggerated comedy, and sudden emotional shifts. In live action, that same energy has to come from the actors, and not everyone fully gets there. The Fire Nation side often comes out stronger. Zuko, Oz, and sometimes Iroh feel like they have more dramatic weight to work with. Their scenes are built around shame, ambition, pressure, power, and family wounds, and that material gives the actors something solid to grab onto. Dallas Liu's Zuko, in particular, tends to feel more focused than a lot of the hero side material. Daniel D. Kim brings presence to Ozai. Even when the show itself gets uneven, that side of the story usually feels more controlled. The main trio is trickier. Their chemistry should be the heart of the show, but because the performances are inconsistent and the writing keeps rushing them forward, they don't always click the way they need to. You get glimpses of it, sure. Small moments where you think, okay, this could grow into something. But then another stiff exchange comes in, or a joke doesn't land, or a serious line sounds too formal, and the group dynamic loses a little spark. That's probably the best way to describe the acting overall. It has sparks. It just doesn't have a steady flame yet. There are also supporting performances that stand out in different ways. Some characters feel closer to the spirit of the original than others. Some actors seem more comfortable inside the heightened tone. Others look like they're still figuring out how big or small to play this world. And that inconsistency makes the show feel like it's still searching for its performance style. Is it supposed to be grounded and serious, a little theatrical, playful and heightened, epic fantasy, coming-of-age adventure? The best version of Avatar is all of those things at once, but live action has to balance that very carefully, and this first season doesn't always manage it. That said, I don't think the acting is beyond repair. Actually, this is one area where future seasons could improve a lot. Young actors grow, chemistry can develop, writers can learn what each performer does best, directors can loosen the scenes up and let the characters feel less locked into speeches. So while the performances are definitely one of the show's weaker points, I wouldn't call them hopeless. They're sincere, they're uneven, and sometimes, honestly, they're frustrating because you can see what they're reaching for. The cast wants this to work. That part is clear, but wanting it to work and making every scene feel alive are two different things. And for a story as emotional, funny, and character-driven as Avatar, the acting can't just be decent. It has to carry the soul. Right now it carries pieces of it, but not the whole thing. For a show like Avatar, The Last Airbender, the main trio is everything. You can have the bending, you can have the Fire Nation. You can have the world building, the costumes, the big music, the dramatic speeches, all of it. But if Aang, Katara, and Sokka don't feel right together, the whole thing starts to wobble. And that's one of the biggest problems with this live-action version. The three of them are there. They're traveling together. They're facing danger together. The story clearly wants us to believe they are becoming this little family on the road. But the chemistry doesn't always feel natural yet. It feels more like the show is placing them in the same scenes and expecting the bond to appear because we already know it should be there. That's not enough. The original animated series made the group dynamic feel effortless. Aang brought the innocence and wonder. Katara brought the emotional drive and compassion. Sokka brought the sarcasm, the insecurity, the jokes, the protective older brother energy. They balanced each other. Even when they argued, there was life in it. You felt the rhythm between them. Here, that rhythm is still shaky. Sometimes Aang feels isolated inside his own burden. Katara feels locked into being serious and supportive. Sokka gets a few comedic lines, but not always enough real bite or awkward personality to bounce off the others. So instead of the group feeling messy and alive, they can feel a little too controlled, a little too written, and this is where the rushed season structure really hurts them. Chemistry needs ordinary moments. You need to see the characters being tired together, annoyed together, bored together, amused by each other. You need the small stuff, the jokes that don't matter, the arguments that are not about destiny. The little looks that say, yeah, these kids are slowly learning how to trust each other. The show doesn't give them enough of that. It gives them danger. It gives them speeches. It gives them shared goals. But shared goals are not the same as emotional connection. Just because characters are moving in the same direction doesn't automatically mean they feel close. And with Aang, Katara, and Sokka, that closeness is supposed to be the heartbeat of the story. There are glimpses where it almost works. A few small exchanges, a few moments where the performers seem to relax, and you can imagine the group dynamic becoming stronger in later seasons. It's not completely dead. That's important to say. It's not like these three have no potential together, but in Season 1, the bond feels underdeveloped. It's especially noticeable because the Fire Nation material often has clearer tension. Zuko and Iroh, for example, have a relationship that feels more defined. Even when it's not perfect, you understand the emotional push and pull. With the main trio, the show sometimes assumes we already care about them as a unit because the original taught us to care. But this version still has to earn that on its own. That's the tricky thing about adaptation. You can borrow the characters' names, their costumes, their destinations, and their major story beats, but you cannot borrow chemistry. Chemistry has to happen in the scenes. It has to build through timing, reactions, silence, mistakes, and personality clashes. Right now, the live-action trio feels like they are still waiting for that spark. And I don't think it's only the actors. The writing plays a huge part. When the dialogue is too formal, or the scenes are too focused on moving the plot, the performers don't get enough room to simply exist together. They're always explaining, reacting, preparing, worrying, or running toward the next major event. That makes the friendship feel functional instead of lived in. What I wanted more of was looseness. Let Aang be weird. Let Sokka be more annoying. Let Katara push back harder. Let them tease each other. Let them have one scene where the world isn't ending for 5 seconds and they can just behave like kids who have been thrown into something way too big. Because that's where the magic starts, not in the big glowing Avatar moments, not even in the bending. The magic starts when you believe these three would actually stay together even if the plot didn't force them to. By the end of the season, I understood the group. I understood what they were supposed to represent, but I didn't always feel them the way I wanted to. And for Avatar, that's a serious issue. The story can survive a few uneven effects. It can survive some awkward costumes. It can even survive changes to the plot. But it needs Aang, Katara, and Sokka to feel like a real team, not just three characters walking through the same adaptation. Aang is probably the hardest character in this entire show to get right, and I don't say that as an excuse for everything that doesn't work. I say it because, honestly, the role is kind of a nightmare in live action. On paper, Aang sounds simple. He's the Avatar, he's the chosen one, he has to save the world, but that's not really what makes him interesting. What makes Aang work is the contradiction inside him. He's powerful, but he's still a child. He's playful, but he's carrying grief. He wants to run away from responsibility, but he's also the only person who can restore balance. He's supposed to be innocent without feeling empty, sad without becoming miserable, and heroic without suddenly turning into some perfect little warrior. That is a very difficult balance. The Netflix version gets pieces of it right. There are moments where Aang's sadness comes through, especially when the show focuses on what he lost. He didn't just wake up after a long nap. He woke up into a world where his people are gone, his home is destroyed, and everyone now looks at him like a solution to a war he never got the chance to prevent. That part of Aang matters. In fact, it might be the part live action is most interested in exploring. This version leans harder into the weight of his trauma, his guilt, and the loneliness of being the last Airbender. And when it works, it gives him a more serious emotional layer. You understand that this kid is not just scared of responsibility because he wants to have fun. He's scared because the world has already punished him for disappearing, even if he never meant for any of it to happen. But the problem is, the show sometimes pushes that sadness so much that Aang loses some of the lightness that should define him. Aang needs joy, not because the story should be childish, but because his joy is what makes the sadness hurt. If he's only written as burdened, guilty, confused, or overwhelmed, then we don't get the full emotional contrast. The original version worked because Aang could be goofy and free one moment, then completely broken the next. You felt the child and the Avatar fighting for space inside him. Here, the Avatar side often swallows the child, and when that happens, Aang can start to feel more like a symbol than a person. The show keeps reminding us that he has a destiny, that the world needs him, that he must become ready. All of that is true, but there are moments where you just want him to breathe, to laugh, to be annoying, to make a bad decision because he's 12, not because the plot needs another emotional crisis. The performance itself is also uneven. Gordon Cormier has the right sincerity for the role. There's a softness to him that fits Aang, and he does bring vulnerability to the character. You can tell he's trying to play the emotional truth of a kid who has lost everything. And I respect that because it would have been very easy to play Aang as just wide-eyed and cute, but some scenes don't land as naturally as they need to. Sometimes the line delivery feels too stiff. Sometimes the heavier dialogue sounds like it's sitting on top of the performance instead of coming from inside it. And sometimes the show puts him in these big emotional or heroic moments before the character has fully earned them in live action. That's not only an acting issue, that's writing, pacing, and direction all piling onto a young performer. Still, the result is noticeable. There are times when Ong should feel magnetic, and instead he feels a little muted. There are moments where his fear or guilt should pull you in, but the scene explains the emotion so directly that it becomes less powerful. And when the show tries to make him serious for too long, he loses some of that strange, bright energy that should make people want to follow him. Then there's the action side of Ong, which is also mixed. Some of the bending moments look good. When the effects are working, you can see the idea of Ong as this light, fast, air-driven fighter. But there are also shots, especially when he's flying or moving through the air, where the CGI becomes distracting. Instead of feeling graceful, it can feel artificial, and with Ong, movement matters. His bending style should feel playful and fluid, almost like he's dancing around danger rather than smashing through it. When that doesn't translate, the character loses another piece of himself. The bigger issue, though, is that the show sometimes makes Ong feel oddly ineffective. There are moments where he comes across less like a young hero learning his way and more like a kid who complains, gets overwhelmed, and needs everyone else to pull him through. Now, to be fair, Ong is supposed to struggle. He should not be instantly capable. That would ruin the whole journey. But struggle needs shape. We need to see him fail, learn, adjust, and grow. We need to feel that even when he's not ready, there is something special inside him beyond the title of Avatar. Sometimes the Netflix version tells us that more than it shows us, and that's where Ong becomes frustrating. Because the foundation is there, the grief is there, the innocence is there in flashes, the burden is clear, but the full personality hasn't completely clicked yet. He needs more playfulness, more mischief, more quiet wonder. More moments where he feels like a kid who loves life, not just a kid crushed by destiny. That's what would make the heavier scenes hit harder. Ong should break your heart because you can still see the joyful child underneath all the loss. If the show lets that side come forward more, then his sadness won't feel repetitive. It will feel tragic. So as of this first season, Ong works in pieces. He's sympathetic, and there are moments where the emotional angle makes sense. But he doesn't always feel as alive, funny, or naturally charismatic as he needs to be for the whole story to orbit around him. And that's important, because Avatar can have great visuals, strong villains, and a huge fantasy world. But if Ong doesn't fully soar, the show stays grounded. Katara is one of the characters where the live-action version really made me feel the difference between recreating a role and actually capturing a personality. Because on paper, Katara is still here. She's still caring. She's still determined. She still wants to become stronger. She still has that emotional connection to her tribe, her family, and the damage the Fire Nation has left behind. The show knows she matters. It knows she is not just the girl in the group. It clearly wants her to be one of the emotional anchors of the story, but something feels missing. And it's not one single thing. It's more like a bunch of smaller things that slowly add up. Katara in the original had fire under the kindness. She could be compassionate, yes, but she could also be stubborn, angry, bossy, impatient, hopeful, reckless, nurturing, and sometimes completely wrong. That mix is what made her feel real. She wasn't just the responsible one. She was a young girl forced to grow up inside a broken world, and sometimes that made her stronger, but sometimes it made her messy. The Netflix version keeps a lot of the seriousness, but it doesn't always keep the mess, and that's where she starts to feel flatter. There are scenes where Katara feels too softened, too controlled, almost like the adaptation is afraid to let her be difficult. She gets emotional material, but not always emotional range. She gets importance in the story, but not always enough personality in the moment. So instead of feeling like this passionate young waterbender pushing against the limits of her world, she can feel more like someone quietly carrying the expected heart of the group role. That's not the same thing. Kaiwantiyo has a natural sincerity, and there are moments where you can see the version of Katara she could grow into. She has the right softness for the character. She looks like she belongs in this world. And when the scene asks her to be gentle or concerned, she can deliver that. But the show doesn't always give her enough sharp edges to play. Katara needs sharp edges. She should not feel perfectly composed all the time. She should have moments where her anger comes out before she knows how to control it. Moments where her confidence is partly real and partly forced. Moments where her hope becomes almost aggressive because she refuses to accept how cruel the world is. That's what makes her interesting. In this version, a lot of that gets toned down, and because the writing already removes some of the humor and casual character interaction, Katara loses even more texture. We don't get enough of her just being a kid with Sokka and Aang. We don't get enough playful frustration, sibling rhythm, awkward friendship, or ordinary warmth. She's often placed in serious scenes, talking about serious things, carrying serious emotions. Again, that's not wrong for Katara, but it can't be all she is. The animated Katara worked because she could be the emotional center without becoming one note. She could comfort someone, then snap at them. She could believe in people, then make a reckless decision because that belief overwhelmed her. She could act mature, but you never forgot she was still young. She had depth because the show let her contradict herself. The live-action version doesn't always allow that contradiction, and when you remove too much of it, her growth becomes less compelling. If Katara starts off too steady, too capable, or too emotionally polished, then the journey doesn't feel as earned. We need to feel her struggle, not just hear about it. We need to see the frustration of someone who wants power but doesn't fully know how to use it yet. Someone who wants to protect people but is still figuring out what strength even means. That's especially important because Katara's role in the group is so central. Aang needs her compassion, but he also needs her honesty. Sokka needs her loyalty, but he also needs her pushback. The audience needs her to be warm, but also alive enough to surprise us. If she becomes too quiet or too emotionally limited, the whole trio loses balance, and that's what happens at times here. The show gives Katara a place in the story, but not always enough force inside the scenes. She should feel like water in motion, gentle one second, powerful the next, impossible to reduce to one shape. Instead, she sometimes feels held back by the writing, like the adaptation has taken a character full of movement and asked her to stand still. That's frustrating because the potential is there. You can see it in small moments. You can imagine a future season where the performance becomes more confident, the writing gives her more bite, and Katara starts feeling less like a careful interpretation and more like a fully lived-in character. I don't think the foundation is broken, but Season 1 doesn't give her enough. It gives her sincerity, but not enough spark. It gives her emotional weight, but not enough complexity. It gives her importance, but not enough personality. And for Katara, that's a real loss, because she was never just the kind one. She was the heart, yes, but she was also the fire inside the water. Sokka is one of those characters where a small change can create a much bigger problem than it looks like at first. Because if you only look at him on the surface, you might think, okay, he's the funny one. He makes comments. He reacts to weird situations. He's the guy without bending who still tries to act like he has everything under control, and the Netflix version does keep some of that. He gets jokes. He gets little comedic lines. He still has that older brother protectiveness. He still has the basic outline of Sokka, but the issue is, the live-action version feels like it sands off too many of his rough edges, and with Sokka, the rough edges are kind of the point. In the original, Sokka could be sarcastic, rude, immature, insecure, and honestly kind of annoying sometimes. But that was important. He wasn't supposed to start as this perfectly likable guy who already knew how to lead. He was a teenager trying to replace the father figure who left, trying to protect his sister, trying to act like a warrior before he had the experience to really be one. That insecurity came out in messy ways. He overcompensated, he made dumb comments, he acted more confident than he was. He could be dismissive, defensive, and sharp with people, especially early on. But because the story allowed him to be flawed, his growth actually meant something. You watched him become more open, more thoughtful, more capable, and more comfortable with the fact that he didn't need bending to matter. The live-action version softens that journey. It feels like the show wants Sokka to be funny without making him too offensive, flawed without making him too uncomfortable, sarcastic without letting the sarcasm really bite. And I understand why. Modern adaptations often get nervous around characters who begin in a more imperfect place. Nobody wants the audience to turn on a lead character too quickly, but if you clean him up too much, you also weaken the arc. Sokka's early flaws were not random mistakes in the writing. They were the setup. His sarcasm, his pride, his awkward masculinity, his need to prove himself, all of that gave the character somewhere to go. When you reduce those qualities, he becomes easier to like in the moment, maybe, but less satisfying over time. That's the trade-off, and it's especially noticeable because Sokka is supposed to bring a certain energy to the group. Aang has wonder and grief. Katara has hope and emotional drive. Sokka brings friction. He questions things. He complains. He says the wrong thing. He cuts through spiritual seriousness with some dumb practical comment. He makes the journey feel less polished and more human. This version gives him a few jokes, but not always enough personality behind them. A comedic one-liner is not the same as a comic character with a worldview. Sokka's humor should come from who he is, his insecurity, his sarcasm, his frustration at being the only non-bender in a world full of impossible powers. When the humor is too safe or too light, it starts to feel like decoration instead of character. And that hurts the trio, because Sokka is not just there to make people laugh. He is there to balance Aang and Katara. He brings doubt when they are too hopeful. He brings practicality when the story gets too mystical. He brings awkward teenage ego into a world of destiny and ancient power. Without that sharper personality, the group dynamic becomes flatter. Ian Ousley does have moments where he feels like he could grow into the role. I don't think the casting is automatically wrong. There are times when his expressions and timing give the character some life, and you can see the version of Sokka the show is aiming for, but the writing doesn't always give him enough bite. It often feels like he's being kept in a safer lane, and Sokka should not feel too safe. He should be funny, yes, but also occasionally frustrating. He should make you roll your eyes, then surprise you. He should seem out of his depth, then prove that his brain, courage, and loyalty are just as valuable as anyone's bending. His whole arc depends on the audience watching him mature from someone pretending to be a leader into someone who actually becomes one. That's a great journey, but it needs a messy starting point. The live-action version seems more interested in making him immediately acceptable than letting him slowly earn that respect. And because of that, his development feels thinner. We don't get the same sense of a boy carrying pressure too big for him, using sarcasm as armor, making mistakes, and slowly learning how to lead without trying to dominate every room. That's the Sokka I missed. Not just the joke machine, not just the guy making funny faces, the kid who feels powerless in a world of benders, so he tries to turn confidence into a weapon. The brother who wants to protect Katara, but doesn't always know how. The future leader who starts off immature because he has to grow into the person the story needs him to become. The Netflix version still has time to fix this. Future seasons could give him more awkwardness, more insecurity, more tactical intelligence, more emotional vulnerability, and sharper humor. They could let him fail in ways that actually matter. They could let him be wrong before asking us to admire him, because Sokka's appeal was never that he was perfect. It was that he wasn't, and that's why softening him too much feels like a mistake. The flaws weren't something to remove. They were the foundation of one of the best growth arcs in the story. Take away too many of those flaws, and you don't make Sokka better. You just make him smaller, if there is one part of Netflix's Avatar. The last Airbender that feels the most confident, it's Zuko. Not perfect. I don't want to oversell it. But compared to a lot of the other character work in this season, Zuko's material has a clearer shape. You understand what he wants, why he wants it, and why that desire is slowly eating him alive. That already gives him an advantage, because while some characters are stuck explaining their emotions, Zuko's entire body language feels like a person who has been carrying shame for too long. He is angry, obviously, but the anger is not the interesting part. The interesting part is what's underneath it, the desperation, the humiliation, the need to prove himself to a father who treats affection like a weapon. Zuko is not just chasing the Avatar because the plot needs a villain on the road. He is chasing the Avatar because he thinks capturing Aang will repair something broken inside his life. His honor, his place in the Fire Nation, his relationship with Ozai, all of it gets twisted into this one impossible mission, and that makes him more compelling than a simple antagonist. Dallas Liu has a strong handle on that wounded intensity. He plays Zuko like someone who is always one insult away from snapping, but also one honest conversation away from falling apart. That's a difficult balance, and for the most part, he carries it well. Even when the writing around him gets a little too direct, the performance gives Zuko a sense of inner pressure. You can feel him trying to become the person he thinks he is supposed to be. That's what works. The show also benefits from giving Zuko some added emotional weight. His backstory is one of the changes that actually helps the live-action version, rather than just crowding it. Instead of feeling like extra material thrown in for the sake of being different, it gives his arc more texture. It lets the audience understand the wound earlier and more clearly. And honestly, that was a smart move, because Zuko is one of those characters who can hold a darker, more dramatic tone without making the show feel empty. His story is already built on pain, exile, family pressure, and obsession. So when the live-action version leans into serious drama with him, it feels more natural than it does with some of the main trio scenes. He fits this heavier version of the world better. That's also why the Fire Nation side often feels stronger overall. There's more tension there. Ozai's presence hangs over everything. Iroh's quiet concern gives Zuko's anger something warmer to push against. Every scene with Zuko has a built-in conflict, what he says he wants versus what he actually needs. That kind of inner contradiction is exactly what the rest of the show sometimes lacks. Aang's side is supposed to be the emotional heart, but Zuko's side often feels like the emotional engine, and that's interesting. Because you're not necessarily rooting for him in a simple way, but you are watching him. You want to understand him. You want to see whether he'll keep sinking deeper into the role the Fire Nation has carved out for him, or whether some part of him can still break free from it. That tension gives his scenes a pull that the show desperately needs. The animated series made Zuko beloved because he was never just the bad guy. He was damaged, proud, wrong, stubborn, embarrassing sometimes, dangerous sometimes. But always human. The Netflix version does not capture every shade of that yet, but it gets closer with Zuko than it does with many others. That's why he stands out. He feels like a character with a path. Not just a role to fill, not just a familiar face recreated for fans, but someone whose journey has direction. You can see the conflict building. You can see the cracks forming. You can see why Iroh keeps trying with him, even when Zuko pushes him away. And you can see why the story keeps returning to him whenever it needs something emotionally heavier. Now, is everything about Zuko perfect here? No. There are still moments where the dialogue could be sharper. Some scenes could use more subtlety. And like the rest of the show, his arc is still affected by the season's compressed structure. More breathing room would have made his obsession, his loneliness, and his relationship with Iroh even stronger. But even with those issues, Zuko feels like one of the few characters who survives the transition with most of his core intact. He has the anger, he has the sadness, he has the pressure of legacy. He has that painful belief that if he just does this one thing, captures this one person, wins this one approval, then maybe everything will finally make sense. And that is exactly the kind of emotional hook this adaptation needs more of, because spectacle can get you through an episode, bending can make a scene exciting, nostalgia can make fans curious, but character is what makes people stay. The technical polish also helps smooth over some weaker stretches. There are scenes where the writing isn't especially sharp, but the production around it keeps things watchable. A strong score, a well-timed sound cue, a clean effects moment, those things can't fix the story, but they can keep the energy alive. And that's kind of the pattern with this show. The craft is often stronger than the dramatic rhythm. You can tell the series wants to be taken seriously as a big fantasy production. It doesn't feel thrown together. It doesn't feel small. It has moments where the audiovisual side is genuinely impressive, where the bending, music, sound, and atmosphere combine into something that feels close to the promise of a live-action Avatar. But technical polish is not the same as magic. That's the line the show keeps walking. You can have a gorgeous score. You can have excellent sound effects. You can have bending that hits with force and a mix that makes the world feel wide. But if the characters don't breathe, if the dialogue over-explains, if the pacing keeps tripping over itself, then the polish becomes support rather than salvation. It helps the show. It doesn't complete it. Still, I'd rather give credit where it's deserved. The sound design and music are not the problem here. If anything, they are part of what keeps the series from feeling flat. They give the world scale, mood, and texture. They remind you that, beneath the uneven writing and character issues, there is a serious attempt to make this adaptation feel cinematic. And in those moments where the bending looks good, the music rises, and the sound gives the elements real weight, you can feel the version of the show that could have been. A version with all the technical power already in place. Now it just needs the storytelling to match the sound of the world it built. The action in Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender, is honestly a mixed experience. There are moments where it works. You get a bending sequence that has weight, the effects line up nicely, the music kicks in, and for a few seconds you can feel the show becoming the big fantasy adventure it wants to be. Fire blasting across the screen, water moving through the air, earth being thrown with real impact. When all of that clicks, it's easy to understand why people wanted to see this world in live action. But then there are other moments where the action feels strangely flat, not always terrible, just not as exciting as it should be, and that's a problem because Avatar is built on movement. The action is not supposed to be random spectacle, it's supposed to express personality. Aang should fight differently from Katara. Katara should move differently from a Fire Nation soldier. Zuko's aggression should feel different from Iroh's restraint. Every fight should tell you something about the person inside it. The live-action version sometimes gets the spectacle, but not always the rhythm. Some fights look carefully staged rather than alive. You can feel the actors hitting marks. You can feel the choreography waiting for the visual effects to arrive. And once you start noticing that, the action loses some of its natural flow. Instead of feeling like bending is coming out of the character's body, it starts to feel like the scene was built in layers, actor movement first, digital element later. That's not always bad, but it can be distracting. The best action scenes are the ones where the physical movement and bending effect feel connected. When a character's stance, expression, and motion all match the element they're using, the scene has energy. It feels like the power belongs to them. But when the movement is too generic, or too slow, or too similar across different bending styles, the fight becomes less memorable. It looks fine, but it doesn't feel special. And with Avatar, fine action is kind of a letdown. Because the original animated series had such a strong sense of combat identity, fights were not just about who was stronger. They were about creativity, timing, philosophy, and personality. Aang avoided direct force. Zuko pushed forward, Katara adapted, Earthbenders stood their ground, Firebenders attacked with pressure and control. The action taught you the rules of the world without needing a speech. Here, the fights sometimes feel more like fantasy action scenes wearing Avatar clothing. Again, not always. There are good moments. Some action sequences are genuinely entertaining, and a few are strong enough to keep the season moving even when the writing gets heavy. The show clearly knows that bending needs to feel cinematic, and it gives us enough visual punch to make certain battles satisfying, but the consistency is not there. Some scenes feel solid, others feel stiff, and a few are almost unintentionally awkward. That's especially noticeable when the camera gets too close to Aang in motion, or when the CGI flying doesn't quite sell the weight and grace of airbending. Instead of feeling free and fluid, it can look a little artificial. And Aang's movement is one place where the show really cannot afford to feel artificial, because airbending should be the most effortless-looking style in the whole world. There are also moments where the fights feel less exciting because the emotional stakes underneath are not strong enough yet. That's something people forget about action. A good fight is not only choreography, it's build-up, it's character. It's tension, it's the reason you care who wins, who loses, who hesitates, who changes. If the scene is just there to show bending, then it can look impressive for a moment and still fade from memory almost immediately. The show's stronger action usually happens when the character stakes are clearer. When Zuko is involved, there's often more intensity because his fights are tied to obsession and desperation. When the Fire Nation side is pushing forward, there's a sharper sense of threat. When the finale reaches its bigger moments, the scale helps the action feel more important, but in other places, the fights can feel like required checkpoints. A battle happens because the episode needs one, not because the emotion has naturally boiled over. That's where the show needs improvement. It needs action scenes that feel less like demonstrations and more like storytelling. The choreography itself also needed more personality, not just bigger moves, not just more effects, personality. Let Sokka's non-bending combat show his insecurity and cleverness. Let Katara's waterbending feel like someone learning confidence in real time. Let Aang's evasive movements feel playful, clever, and instinctive. Let Zuko's firebending feel angry but disciplined, like someone trying to control pain through force. That's what would make the action memorable, because right now, some of the fights are fun to watch but not always fun to remember, and there's a difference. The show has enough technical ability to create impressive moments. The effects team can make the elements look strong. The sound design gives impacts weight. The music knows when to rise, but fight choreography has to do more than support the visuals. It has to carry character through motion. When the action forgets that, it becomes empty spectacle, not bad spectacle necessarily, just spectacle that doesn't hit as hard as it should. Still, I don't think the action is a failure. It's one of those areas where you can see the foundation of something better. The show has the tools. It has the powers, the world, the stakes, and the visual effects. What it needs now is sharper choreography, clearer bending identities, and more emotional build-up before the fights begin. Because Avatar action should make you feel the element, yes, but more importantly, it should make you feel the person bending it. And in this first season, the action gets halfway there. Sometimes more, sometimes less. It can look exciting. It just doesn't always move with the soul of the original. One thing Netflix's Avatar, The Last Airbender, makes clear pretty quickly is that this version wants to feel heavier, not just bigger, heavier. The animated series had serious material, obviously. War, genocide, imperialism, grief, spiritual imbalance, broken families. It was never some lightweight kid's adventure pretending nothing bad could happen. But the original had a way of balancing those darker ideas with humor, warmth, and a kind of adventurous looseness. Netflix's version leans much harder into the war drama side of the story. You feel that in the Fire Nation scenes. You feel it in the way Ozai is presented. You feel it in the political tension, the family pressure, the military planning, the sense that power is always being tested and measured. There's more focus on schemes, control, loyalty, fear, and what it means to lead through domination. And honestly, some of that works. The Fire Nation benefits from this darker approach because that part of the story already has the right ingredients. Ozai's cruelty feels more grounded when the show treats him like a political ruler instead of just a distant fantasy villain. Zuko's pain feels sharper when you understand the system he comes from. Azula's early placement, even if it doesn't fully work yet, at least shows that the adaptation is interested in the Fire Nation as a family machine, not just an evil army. That's where the mature tone makes sense. This is a world at war. People are suffering. The Fire Nation has burned through cultures, families, and entire ways of life. If live action wants to make that feel more immediate, I don't think that's automatically a bad instinct. In fact, some viewers may prefer that the show doesn't soften the violence too much. Firebenders are not just making pretty flames, they are dangerous. Their power hurts people, their conquest has consequences. So yes, a darker tone can add weight. The problem is that Avatar cannot survive on weight alone. When the show becomes too serious for too long, it starts losing the emotional color that made this world special. Everything begins to feel tense, urgent, and important, but not always alive. The characters talk about responsibility, pain, destiny, war, and survival, so often that you begin to miss the smaller human moments between all that pressure. And that's the tricky part. The original didn't avoid darkness. It made the darkness hit harder by surrounding it with life. Aang could be goofy before being devastated. Sokka could make a ridiculous joke before revealing insecurity. Iroh could talk about tea and then quietly break your heart. The show understood that tragedy needs contrast. Netflix's version sometimes forgets the contrast. It treats maturity like seriousness, and those are not the same thing. A story can be mature and still funny, mature and still playful, mature and still weird. In fact, Avatar almost needs that combination. The whole point is that these kids are moving through a broken world, but they are still kids. They should laugh at the wrong times. They should be immature. They should get distracted. They should want normal things even when the world keeps asking them to become symbols. When the adaptation strips too much of that away, the darker tone starts to flatten the experience. You can see the intention. Netflix wants the world to feel more dangerous and cinematic. It wants the Fire Nation's war to feel brutal. It wants the politics and family drama to carry more adult tension. And on the villain side, again, that mostly helps. But when that same seriousness spreads across the entire show, it drains some of the fun from Aang's journey. That's where the balance breaks. Aang's story should have sadness, but also wonder. Katara's story should have pain, but also warmth. Sokka's story should have pressure, but also sharp comedy. Iroh's story should have grief, but also joy. If everyone is forced into the same serious register, then the world becomes less varied. An Avatar is supposed to be varied. That's literally built into the idea of the four nations. Different cultures, different philosophies, different ways of moving through life. The tone should reflect that. The show should be able to feel playful in one place, spiritual in another, terrifying in another, and political somewhere else. The Netflix version sometimes makes everything feel like it belongs to the same dramatic temperature. Not always, but often enough to notice. Still, I don't want to dismiss the darker approach completely. There are places where it gives the adaptation its strongest identity. The political side of the Fire Nation is interesting. The idea of showing more strategy, backstabbing, and pressure inside the royal family could become one of the better additions if future seasons sharpen it. There is room for this version to explore the cost of war in a way live action can handle well. But it needs balance. That word keeps coming back with this show, and it fits a little too perfectly. Balance between spectacle and emotion, balance between faithfulness and reinvention, balance between seriousness and play. Right now, the darker tone gives the show weight, but not always soul. It makes the world feel more dangerous, but sometimes less joyful. It makes the Fire Nation stronger, but occasionally makes the heroes feel trapped inside a version of the story that has forgotten how fun the journey should be. And that's the thing with Avatar. The darkness matters, but the light is what makes us care when that darkness threatens to swallow everything. The frustrating thing about Netflix's Avatar. The Last Airbender is that I don't think this show is beyond saving. Actually, that might be why it's so frustrating in the first place. If it were completely terrible, the conversation would be easy. We'd all just say, well, that didn't work, move on, and probably rewatch the animated series again. But this adaptation isn't that simple. It has real problems, yes, but it also has enough good pieces that you can see a stronger version hiding somewhere underneath. That's what keeps the hope alive. The world is there. The basic story still works. The bending can look genuinely impressive. The Fire Nation side has strong dramatic material. Zuko is already one of the best parts of the series. Ozai has presence. Iroh has a foundation, even if he needs more warmth. Some supporting characters show promise. And even with the uneven acting, you can tell the younger cast may grow more comfortable if the writing gives them better material. So no, I don't think this first season is a dead end. It feels more like a rough beginning, a show still trying to figure out what kind of adaptation it wants to be. And honestly, Season 2 has a real opportunity to fix some of the biggest issues. The first thing it needs is breathing room. Not every episode has to feel like it's racing against the Netflix skip button. Let the characters sit in a moment. Let them travel. Let them argue about something small. Let them laugh. Let Aang, Katara, and Sokka actually feel like kids who are becoming friends, not just three important characters being pushed through a fantasy checklist. That one change alone would help so much, because the emotional core of Avatar is not just the war, it's not just Aang mastering the elements, it's not just Zuko hunting him, it's the relationships, the slow growth. The little moments where people change without realizing they're changing. If future seasons understand that, the whole show could start feeling more alive. The writing also needs to trust the audience more, less over-explaining. Fewer speeches that announce the emotional point of the scene, more behavior, more silence, more tension that comes from what characters don't say. This world is rich enough to speak for itself. The show doesn't need to underline every theme in heavy dialogue. It needs to let the audience feel the weight through action, choice, and consequence. And the actors need space to loosen up. That's especially true for the main trio. The performances may improve naturally as the cast grows into the roles, but the script has to help them. Give Sokka sharper humor and more insecurity. Give Katara more fire, more frustration, more complexity. Give Aang more joy, not just guilt. Let their personalities clash in ways that are funny, awkward, and imperfect. That's where the chemistry can start to build. Azula also needs serious work going forward. If the show wants her to become a major threat, it has to stop treating her like a promise and start making her feel dangerous. Show her intelligence, show her strategy, show why people would fear her. Don't just tell us she wants approval from Ozai. Let us see how that need turns into control, cruelty, and precision. Because right now, Zuko feels like a character with a future. Azula needs to feel like one too. There's also room to sharpen the action. The bending already looks good in many places, but the choreography needs more personality. Each element should move differently. Each fighter should feel distinct. The action should not just be visual spectacle, it should reveal character. If the show gets that right, the fight scenes could become much more memorable instead of just impressive in the moment. And visually, the world needs more texture. Less clean, less staged, more lived in, more worn, more natural. The costumes, wigs, and environments need to feel like they belong to people who have been living through a 100-year war, not like they were prepared carefully for a fantasy photo shoot. The production design has the scale, now it needs more authenticity. That's really the pattern with the whole show. The foundation is there, the feeling is what needs work, and maybe that's why I'm still cautiously hopeful. Because most of the problems don't feel impossible to fix. They're not issues with the core premise. They're not proof that Avatar can never work in live action. They're execution problems, writing problems, rhythm problems, tone problems, character problems. Big problems, sure, but not unfixable ones. The show needs to stop trying so hard to prove it respects the original and start finding the confidence to breathe as its own version. Not by abandoning what fans love, by understanding it better, because the heart of Avatar was never just in the major plot points. It was in the balance between grief and joy, comedy and war, childhood and destiny, friendship and responsibility. If Netflix can find that balance, this adaptation could improve dramatically. Season 1 feels like a first draft with expensive visuals. Season 2 needs to feel like a story that knows itself, and I do want it to get there. That's the honest part. Even after all the complaints, I want this version to succeed. I want the cast to grow. I want the writing to sharpen. I want the characters to feel warmer, messier, and more alive. I want the bending to become more distinct. I want the world to feel less polished and more real, because there is something here. Not enough yet, but something. And if the show learns from its mistakes instead of doubling down on them, it could become more than just a decent live-action adaptation. It could become a version of Avatar that actually earns its place beside the original, not above it, not replacing it, but standing there with its own purpose. For now, though, that's still potential. A spark. A flame that hasn't gone out, but definitely needs tending.